Chapter 251: The Player Rankings. In a completely different section of the island, the two pink-haired sisters were also fighting for their lives, but their situation was not as critical as Tim's. When they encountered a predator or participant they could not defeat, they had adopted a radical solution of setting fire to the jungle. A few well-placed fireballs were enough to set off a nearly unstoppable forest fire, and this had allowed them to flee several times. It was also the way they had solved the riddle of their second ordeal. By letting a large portion of the jungle burn, they had discovered that they were able to survive this mysterious affliction. When the charred plants and the burnt earth had cooled down, several red, green, and blue lights had started oozing out of the ground, and they had been able to easily identify the different properties of the minerals responsible. Like Jake at the time of his first success, the sanctuary bubble had not immediately recognized their success, and indeed the following night they had died without being able to resist. They had then understood that just burning the jungle was not enough, and they had taken the time to scan and experiment with each type of ore. Both sisters now knew, as Tim did, that green light was synonymous with security and peace on this island. But unlike Tim, they also knew very clearly that they were at risk when approaching areas rich in flintium, red, or oxanium, blue. Armed with this information and with their improved control of Fireball, it had not been so difficult to pass the second trial. However, just like the young boy, their arrival on the real island had turned out to be a real hell. Cough, cough, and Enya. I can't do it anymore. Essia stammered and coughed non-stop because of the smoke from their latest fire. If you can still complain, shut up and run. Her older sister replied curtly, whipping out the sweat dripping from her forehead with a flick of her hand. The two sisters were practically naked and covered with dust and soot, while their pink hair, usually shiny and silky, was now tangled, sticky, and dirty, giving them a look that would not be out of place among a group of beggars. It was a miracle that they had managed to find each other so soon after their arrival on the real island. It was as if the sanctuary bubble itself did not want to separate them. As they fled together without having a precise destination, they hoped that their companions would not be so far away either. Unfortunately, according to Jake's rankings, Kyle and Sarah still hadn't reached the island, and Will and Tim were nowhere to be found. After all this time, they had yet to come to terms with the fact that their two companions had failed. But as they shared this thought, Jake's name suddenly appeared in the rankings, followed moments later by that of Sarah. Only Kyle's name remained missing. With renewed hope, they started running again, hoping to meet them soon. Jake and Sarah were the hand-to-hand fighters in the group, and they were confident that they could make it through as a team with these two. Shortly after they had set the dense vegetation behind her on fire to block the way to their enemies, high-pitched guttural sounds echoed across the flames. These voices seemed indignant and angry, but they were powerless to overcome this natural obstacle. Soon they withdrew, and the silence returned, broken only by the crackling of the wood that had been bursting under the flame's influence. Back on Jake, he still hadn't moved from his hiding place, safe from any outside threat. Unlike the clearings that Tim had discovered, the clearing he was in was nothing special, but it was virtually inaccessible by any means other than by air. With the Green Soul Stone, he could stay there as long as he wanted, so he took the opportunity to analyze the new features available in more detail on the spot. First of all, the player rankings. When he accessed the interface with a thought, he was shocked to discover that he was actually quite high-ranked. All the points he had earned from his exploits in the first event had indeed been counted in his total score, and he currently peaked at 468,300 points, of which 418,300 points were exclusively from his prowess in the first event. The genocides he had perpetrated had a more than decisive impact on his score. With the ether he already had at the beginning of the ordeal, he had almost 850,000 ether points in his bracelet, which could be considered a real fortune at his current level, although it was still not enough to buy anything interesting in the Oracle store. Nevertheless, by examining the player rankings more meticulously, he noticed several details. His outstanding current score, which immediately brought him to the 121st place, was far from being the highest score. To be fair, he didn't know how many bonus points a participant could get by finishing a trial among the first, and therefore he didn't know whether these scores were considered normal or not. Regardless, the top 20 had staggeringly high scores, far exceeding those of the other participants. The top 5, in particular, had scores so high that it was questionable. Player rankings. First place, Hakrasha, species. Jackham 7,637,287 points, 3 kills. Second place, Krish, species. Krish 6,387,296 points, 172 kills. Third place, Bawopi, species. Nosk 6, 385,279 points, 211 kills. Fourth place, Krish, species. Krish 5,432,486 points, 157 kills. Fifth place, Krish, species. Krish 5,231,862 points, 155 kills. With the exception of the first in the ranking, the other 4 participants shared a common characteristic. They were all player killers, and their names were displayed in red. What the heck is wrong with these guys who all have the same name as their species? Jake was taken aback for a brief moment as he found out the details of the second, fourth, and fifth place. Together, they had decimated over 500 participants, which was more than 1/15 of the players who had made it to the third trial. Their scores were so high that it was disconcerting, and not surprisingly, he discovered that there was a good reason for this. In addition to strongly encouraging them to kill each other to reduce the number of candidates competing for the fourth round, the sanctuary bubble had given an incentive that was almost impossible to resist. When a player knocked down another contestant, he would get all his points right away. Jake didn't know if the loser kept the ether earned outside of the ordeal, but he didn't intend to confirm it personally. In any case, once one was dead, it meant one had not been up to the challenge. Worried for his companions, he started looking for their names without much expectation, and this time he was truly appalled when he discovered that all his friends were already on the island except for Kyle. Sarah was ranked 626th with 186,600 points, while Will had a very surprising score of 246,100 points, giving him a place in the ranking relatively close to Jake. Tim and the 2 sisters were currently ranked rather low, all 3 of them below the top 5,000, but the mere fact that they were still persevering on the island was commendable in itself. Jake had just realized that he didn't know them that well. The fact that they had passed the first trial already proved that they were much more resilient mentally than he thought they were capable of. Only Kyle seemed to fit the image of the insecure playboy he had of him. However, there were 2 names that made him shudder when he saw them. The first was Lu Yen at 148th place with 8 kills. Even if he wanted to, Jake would be unable to forget that name. This bitch had shown her true nature during their first ordeal, and he knew she was a viper among vipers. If he met her again on this island, he would avoid her like the plague or would show his fangs without the slightest hesitation. This name may have been relatively common in China, but he knew for sure that it was her when he found her brother's name not far away in the ranking. This greatly reduced the likelihood that it was a different woman. The second name that left him hesitating was much higher in the ranking and was currently at the 7th place. 7th place, Ruby Hale, species. Human 3,845,569 points, 98 kills. The image of this young woman smiling in a wheelchair despite her crippling disability and ugliness came back to him, and he was unable to associate her with this Ruby Hale in 7th place, capable of slaughtering 98 participants in cold blood. The idea was so bizarre that he automatically put it out of his mind. If these 2 Ruby Hales were really the same people, then he was a very poor judge of character. Yet, Jake was not a total fool either. He too had changed enormously. If the Ruby Hale of that time met him today, there was a good chance that she wouldn't recognize him either. Chapter 252, Back to the Ocean. Despite the doubts that ran through his mind, Jake drove the disabled young woman from his mind. If fate wished for them to meet in this ordeal, it would happen naturally if they both survived until the next ordeal. For the moment, the priority was to find his companions and think about his survival strategy on this island. Surviving on the island until the descent of the Phantom Sanctuary was not the only tricky problem to solve. In addition to the fact that the number of places inside the sanctuary would be limited, it was also necessary to determine where the sanctuary in question would appear. The description of the third trial spoke of a descent, which suggested that the Phantom Sanctuary would descend from the sky like a spaceship, but this could very well be a metaphor. This vessel or building could either descend from the sky or rise from the bottom of the ocean or the earth. By instinct, Jake was tempted to go towards the center of the island. The high plateaus and the snow-capped mountain range disappearing in the clouds was a seemingly ideal place, but it could also be a decoy leading to a waste of precious time. The feats to be accomplished in the feat or exploration category were not just limited to massacring or cataloging the local fauna and flora. There were construction challenges, standard exploration challenges such as climbing the highest mountain on the island, but also all kinds of missions that encouraged them to discover the secrets that the island abounded with. There were several archaeology and adventure challenges to discover the ruins and abandoned monuments on the island, but also much more daring challenges, such as finding the place on the island that produced the crystals inserted in the foreheads of certain animals like the feathered T-Rex that Jake had defeated on several occasions. The mystery of the soul stones was also part of it, and according to the interface of the sanctuary bubble, Jake was far from having solved the mystery completely. However, none of this mattered at the moment. What made Jake wary right now was the fact that the Oracle system seemed to be back up and running. The Shadow Guide, who wouldn't appear during the simulation trials, was once again behaving the way he expected him to. With a thought, he could determine in which direction Tim, the two sisters, Will and Sarah stood, and if this could be good news in some ways, it also posed major issues. As strong as Jake had become, he wasn't confident in his ability to take on the players at the top of the rankings. The number one didn't seem to be especially aggressive towards the other participants, but it was clear that many of the top contenders were actively trying to reduce the number of players on the island, whether it was to steal their points or reduce the competition. Jake had focused on long-term growth and currently had no way to escape the shadow guides of other players. Any player with an Oracle rank equal to or higher than his would be able to locate him and conspire against him. Conversely, he had no way to ambush or detect these players. After his misadventure with Yerode and Lamine, Jake had become particularly suspicious of this type of scenario, and unfortunately, there was no ideal countermeasure other than increasing his Oracle rank or making sure he was stronger than these potential enemies. To some extent, this could also be an advantage he could take advantage of. By default, these player killers would tend to underestimate him because his Oracle rank was lower than theirs. The problem was that most of the time, the Oracle rank was usually justified. All evolvers with an Oracle rank 6 or higher at their second ordeal could not be weak. There was another issue that Jake had also realized when he arrived on the real island. All of the animals present were alive and no longer part of a simulation. This meant that some of the feats to be performed would naturally cause a bloodbath on the island. For example, if each participant tried to kill 100,000 sharks to complete the corresponding diamond shark hunter feat, there was a good chance that there would not be enough sharks on the island for everyone. This was not only because the size of the island was limited, but rather because the ocean was not. The marine fauna could very well flee to the open sea and keep its distance until the ordeal was over. On the island itself, the problem was even worse. The land animals had nowhere to flee to. The last aspect that Jake had to take into account, and which he hadn't been able to verify yet, was that the simulations during the first two trials had probably been calibrated for each player. If Tim had had to face megalodons or mosasaurs like the ones he had encountered, it would have been impossible for the kid to reach the shore before he did. Because these megalodons were not only physically impressive, their ether stats were also pretty high. The creatures on the island or in the water could thus prove to be weaker than the ones he was used to, but could also turn out to be much more dangerous since the strongest players also had to face an ordeal worthy of them. There was good news in all this, though, and it had to do with the fact that Jake was now on the island with his real body. This had a weighty consequence. His physical stats and etheric could now grow normally, and it was very likely that the defeated monsters would yield some ether from now on. It was for this reason that Jake felt it was unwise to seek out his friends at this time. If they were so eager to find him, they would come to him on their own. If they were eliminated along the way, it could not be blamed on him anyway. After all, the ordeal was, in essence, individual. Thus, it was only logical that Jake headed to the beach where he had first birthed. He knew the sea creatures by heart, unlike those on the island where he was still relatively ignorant, and the ocean had proven to be a safer place, since at least he could survive the night without dying inexplicably. The flintium and orxanium didn't seem to have any effect away from the shore. It was still early, and luckily Jake didn't encounter any aggressive creatures on his way. By this time, the creatures were either in a weakened physical and mental state or were in a deep sleep. With the exception of the humanoid giant, Jake had not encountered anything really threatening during the day. However, this did not mean that the island was safe, and as a precaution, Jake made his way back by traveling underground. About 20 minutes later, he had returned to the beach, but the pterodactyl corpse was no longer there, which was consistent with the fact that this was only a simulation previously. "What do you think of this plan, She?" Jake asked seriously as he contemplated the swirling of the waves. "Excellent choice." The hologram of She nodded at his side, her immaterial legs flashing through the water. Her beauty was as mesmerizing as ever. "With the 2 soul glyphs you've got, your speed through the water is decent and small predators will be intimidated by your approach, allowing you to focus on the larger prey. Although completing all of the diamond hunting feats may not be possible, the platinum feats should be attainable. Most importantly, I'll be able to put my Murtharian bloodline to good use." Jake added with a confident smile. "For the first time, it will feel like a grinding session in a video game. As long as these monsters prove to be a challenge, I'll be able to progress swiftly. Once I'm strong enough, I'll be able to start hunting the creatures on the island and take care of the other feats and quests." With his confidence and ambition rekindled, Jake didn't fall into arrogance this time. Before entering the water, he made himself a new machete using his earth and heat control skills and inserted the green soul stone into its handle. He then re-spent the 500 ether points needed to inject as much gray ether as possible into his new weapon. The amount previously spent had obviously been refunded when he had died during his previous attempt. Armed with his new weapon, Jake marched with a conquering step towards the ocean, and then dived headfirst when a wave a little higher than the others tried to swallow him up. The effect of the soul glyph was immediately activated, and a slight shimmer appeared on his skin, drastically improving his hydrodynamics. A moment later, Jake was splitting the waves at a speed close to 50 kilometers per hour. It wasn't much compared to the marine predators lurking around the island, but it was more than enough to do what he had to do. A few minutes later, he came across a school of rather familiar giant jellyfish, and a new genocide began, on the real island this time. But as Jake grew stronger, second after second, his companions and cousins were also following the flow of their own adventure. Sadly, not everyone was destined to be a winner. Chapter 253, Tim's Misadventures Part 2. Not so far from Jake's position, Tim was going nuts. The goddamn alien on his tail hadn't given up the chase after all this time, and because of that, he had been unable to focus on any side objective. Worse, he was completely exhausted and hungry. He had sweated all his body as sweat. His tongue was painfully dry and his lips were cracked. If he didn't find a solution quickly, he had already made up his mind that he wouldn't last through the night. His pursuer had made it impossible for him to camp in one of the safe clearings on the island, and he didn't know about the green soul stone. Not that it would have made the slightest difference, since he didn't know where to find one. For the young boy, these expanses of green grass radiating at night was simply the equivalent of a rest area that the sanctuary bubble had provided for them. At no time had he bothered to find out where these lights were coming from and what their real significance was. What he did know, however, was that after several days without finding any refuge, the benefits he had derived from this light had begun to wane, and the previous night had been life-threatening for him. He had felt his consciousness clouding, and he had only a very vague memory of last night. If he couldn't find a way out, he was absolutely certain that he would die without even realizing it, for some reason or another. Tim had already exhausted his luck a long time ago, and was now suffering from a string of bad luck. On several occasions, he had stumbled over roots, or had been shat on by a tropical bird sleeping on a branch above him. These misadventures were limited in their effect, but they weighed on his mind, already close to its breaking point. His body was riddled with scrapes and bruises caused by his falls and unfortunate contacts against brambles, and without his high constitution and vitality, he probably would have had to be hospitalized. Still, Tim hadn't faltered yet. He still had one last hope, to regroup with his comrades. Alone, he didn't stand a chance against this crazy alien, but with Jake or Sarah it was different. Except that when the aliens had come after him, Jake and Sarah hadn't yet reached the island. To survive, he had been left with no other choice but to put his choice on Will. Although the two sisters were cute and sweet, he didn't believe for a second that they could handle the threat behind him. Will wasn't the best fighter, far from it, but he had a good head on his shoulders. He was definitely the smartest of the group after Jake, if not the cleverest based on his experience, and the mere fact that he had arrived on the island before Jake proved that he was much more resourceful than they had originally assumed. Unfortunately, once again, as if fate was against him, meeting Will had turned out to be a real headache. It was the first strategy he had adopted at the beginning of the third trial, long before these Krish aliens decided to target him as their prey. His shadow guide, who was supposed to show him the way to Will, would constantly change direction, sometimes making him run east for 100 kilometers, before suddenly changing course in the opposite direction. Because of his inconsistencies, Tim had been close to being devoured by a dinosaur several times, and with the psychopath behind him, he had to give up the idea when the shadow guide had told him that Will was no longer in front, but behind him in the same direction as his pursuer. In his current state of fatigue and distress, Tim was incapable of complex reasoning, and out of panic he had even begun to search for the two pink-haired sisters, albeit without any hope. He had been running in their direction for several hours already, to no avail. Even after all this time, he had only explored a fraction of the island. Who knew how many hundreds or thousands of kilometers away they were? The only thing he knew was that the two sisters were together, so they were much luckier than he was at the moment. Quite a feat for someone whose every ability was based on luck. But just when the kid thought that all was over for him, he happened to glance at the player rankings and his eyes filled with delight. His heart suddenly raced with excitement, and almost in disbelief, he immediately wished for his bracelet to calculate how to find Jake or Sarah as quickly as possible. Confirming that the results of the player rankings were real, the shadow guide revealed two different trajectories, which miraculously were both heading in roughly the same direction. Even better, not in the same direction as the alien on his heels. Tim estimated that he was about 10 minutes ahead of the Krish behind him, but that was on the condition that his pursuer would maintain the same stupid tactic of frontally destroying all the natural obstacles that the boy had taken great care to leave untouched after his passage. At first, some sort of super powerful weapon or ether skills would gladly atomize these bramble and creeper walls, but lately the alien seemed to have given up on this method. If not for that, Tim would have been caught long ago. If the Krish in question had been able to read the boy's thoughts, he would have immediately retorted in rage, "The heck? Do you have any fucking idea how much each shot costs me?" Of course, even if Tim knew, it wouldn't have made any difference. On the contrary, it would have cheered him up. Right now, he was in great need of it. As a precaution, the young boy tested his bracelet with different wishes to determine who was closest between Jake, Sarah, and the two sisters, and almost broke down in tears when it was the shadow guide pointing at Jake who showed up. With renewed faith, Tim ran with all his might, carried by a wind of optimism. He didn't know if he would have to run for an hour or several days, but what he did know was that the oracle path guaranteeing his survival was wavering. If joining Jake was the ideal choice, the two shadow guides would have overlapped each other, but it wasn't the case. The variation between the two shadow guides was subtle, and in the end Tim was just a child. Perhaps out of fatigue or simply because deep down he wanted the reassuring protection of an adult, he deliberately chose to continue his run to Jake, and soon the oracle path adapted his calculation to produce a new and unique shadow guide. As he got closer to his savior, the boy could hear the heavy footsteps of the alien on his heels getting closer and closer. Every once in a while, the roar of a sleeping beast that Tim had been careful to avoid would be heard, followed by a heart-rending cry of agony. Each time this happened, he couldn't help but get goosebumps and pick up the pace once again. Nevertheless, as he got closer and closer to his target, he began to have doubts. It turned out that he had already explored this part of the island in the past. It was largely because of this that he had been able to escape from these experienced aliens for so long. His incredible luck only partially explained his performance. In that part of the jungle where he was, he remembered having escaped from a pack of raptors after crushing one of their eggs, just as his exhausted luck was receding. This was not important in the present circumstances, though. What was of concern was that if he kept going in that direction for a few more minutes, he would be leaving the jungle for the white sandy beach. In a different context, this might have been good news, but in his case it meant losing the protection of the natural obstacles that had allowed him to survive so far. Jake is on the beach? Tim speculated, unconsciously choosing to believe in the hypothesis that suited him best. If Jake was really on the beach, he was saved. A moment later, the boy saw the flora transitioning from lush tropical vegetation to a few scattered palm trees. The wet and muddy soil was also mixed and then replaced by white sand. He had finally reached the beach. But on the beach there was not a single soul around, and certainly not Jake. Yet the shadow guide did not intend to give up. As if that were the most logical way to proceed, the holographic Tim jumped into the water without hesitating and started to swim towards the open ocean. Fuck, Tim swore reluctantly. Like all children his age, he was like a sponge absorbing the good or bad habits of his companions. Jake and Kyle had a really foul mouth, while Will was the only one who seemed to care about manners. Should I get in the water? Tim almost broke down when he saw his shadow guide dive headfirst. As if to give himself courage, he squinted his eyes to better scrutinize the murky and turbulent water, but that was the moment that a giant shark a few hundred meters away chose to jump into the air, a half-dead walrus between his teeth. Chapter 254 Tim's Misadventures Part 3. Feet in the water and aware that he was about to commit a foolish deed, Tim crawled back to shore in sheer fright. If he had really dived after his shadow guide, only God knew if he would have survived more than a minute in the water. Even before meeting Jake, he most likely would have been devoured by a predator 10 times his size. In the simulations of his first and second trial, there were certainly sharks, crocodiles, and other dinosaurs, but their size was rather humble. With his luck and current stats, it was not impossible for him to survive a confrontation if he knew where to strike. He might have died many times, but the challenge was not impossible, or he would never have reached the shore so easily. But this shark, even with his ether luck stat maxed, it was absolutely impossible to outrun such a predator. The sea monster would probably swallow him in one bite, just like this poor walrus weighing several tons. Boom! Jolted by the explosion behind him, the boy suddenly turned around, but all he saw was a pillar of flames and smoke about a kilometer away. His blood froze in his veins, and his heart was on the verge of a heart attack. The alien on his heels had almost caught up with him. A kilometer could take 15 to 30 minutes for a normal human in a jungle as inhospitable as this one. But for evolvers like them, it would only take 1 or 2 minutes at most. Holy crap! Get the fuck off my back! Tim cursed again, clawing his head with his hands so hard that his hair was ripped out of his head. He was on the edge right now. All hope had abandoned him, and his terror was such that he couldn't even think straight. To enter the water or to leave. Instead, he did something even more stupid. Jake! Jake! Ache! 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 The child's call for help echoed throughout the area, alerting all nearby predators and accurately revealing his position to his pursuer, who until then had no way of determining whether his prey was close or far away. Realizing that the human was right in front of him, the Krish chuckled gleefully. One would be wrong to underestimate the power of the boy's cry. With his strength and constitution, combined with adrenaline and his high-pitched voice that hadn't yet broken, Tim had a good pair of lungs that rivaled even the loudest monsters. At this point, the alien was now the least of his worries. After the echo of his cry became inaudible, silence fell again, and the kid began to realize the stupidity of his action. As his brain suddenly cooled down, his emotional outburst gave way to a state of mental emptiness, which in turn was quickly replaced by a sense of horror. What have I done? Tim stammered, his chin, lips and eyebrows trembling successively between fear, anger towards himself, and the shock of having actually committed such a folly. Forcing himself to breathe in and out deeply, the boy began counting the seconds in his head, praying with all his heart that his shout had not been for naught. Regrettably, the ocean remained silent. To be honest, the ocean seemed even quieter than before, as if the whole island was scoffing at his efforts. On the contrary, it was the trees behind him that began to capsize noisily, as if a behemoth of considerable mass was approaching his position in a charge that nothing seemed to be able to stop. The creepers and brambles that the alien chasing him had so much trouble getting around, despite the use of his weapon or powers, were nothing more than straw twigs in front of this creature. and at this rate, it would reach the beach in less than 30 seconds. Even if Jake had heard it, it was impossible for him to swim back to the shore in such a short time. Biting his lip to the point of blood, Tim took one last glance at the motionless surface of the ocean. Then with a sigh, he sprinted along the beach towards Sarah. The only good thing about this short break was that he was able to catch his breath, but he had lost all his lead and had challenged all the predators in the area. His only hope now was that his luck had not completely run out and that the alien chasing him would be intercepted by the behemoth. If that happened, even if he was eliminated, he would at least have the meager satisfaction of having achieved revenge. As Tim ran as if there would be no tomorrow on the white sandy beach, he heard a huge crack coming from the former spot where he had yelled Jake's name. As he turned his head fleetingly, he saw two palm trees, about 20 meters high, bursting into splinters. The monster responsible was an enormous creature whose morphology was close to that of a bull doped with steroids crossed with a triceratops. In addition to being so huge that an adult T-Rex would only reach its knees, the dinosaur was covered with scales and green spikes so long and thick that it could probably survive a missile strike. The poor trees in its path hadn't had a chance at all, despite the fact that his meager knowledge suggested that this monster was probably herbivorous. The overwhelming ferocity of this colossus annihilated any thought in him to make friends with the creature. Clearly, the lord of the place had been challenged by his cry, and if he made the mistake of retracing his steps, he was certain to be pulverized with one blow of its horn. Tim expected such a heavy creature to be clumsy and stupid, but he nearly pissed himself when he saw the bull triceratops skillfully breaking on the sand while drifting sideways like a top alpine skier. The dinosaur then swiftly spun around, sniffing the air, and as if the boy was wearing a distinctive bug, the monster's furious gaze suddenly locked onto him. Not thinking that he could still sweat, Tim began to drip again and realized that he hadn't yet reached the lowest depths of despair. There was one more step to go, and he had just reached it. Knowing that staying on the white sand made him an apparent target, he changed direction without a second thought and leapt back into the jungle. He hoped that the lush vegetation and the many fragrances of flowers, soil, and other animal pheromones would provide him with the camouflage he needed. Seconds later, another BOM sounded and the earth shook beneath his feet. Soon after, a shock wave lifted a mountain of earth and leaves, turning the ground over at the entrance to the jungle. The Triceratops was now on his heels too. Desperate, he continued to flee by changing directions several times. But just when he thought he would never be able to escape, he suddenly came across a group of humans. There were 4 humans in this group, and none of the faces were familiar to him. Nevertheless, these 4 individuals all shared one thing in common. They were young, none of them over 30 years old. The 2 young women among them seemed not to have reached their 20s yet. The 2 young brunette women, whose beauty was difficult to appreciate given their dirty state, wore an unattractive rudimentary leather armor that had clearly been made during the ordeal from the skin of several mammals. The 2 men were slightly older, but did not seem to lust over their 2 female partners. One was small, chubby, and hairy, with dark skin, while the other was bald and hairless with a shredded physique. Both wore only the basic loincloth provided at the beginning of the first trial, but neither of them seemed to care. Not knowing if their intentions were friendly, Tim bypassed them without breaking his sprint and simply shouted, "Flee." If these humans refused to follow his advice, he felt he had nothing to do with it. As if they couldn't understand him, the 4 humans watched him with curiosity, staring at him disappearing into the distance without showing the slightest sign of movement. But as soon as the child disappeared, the bald man suddenly cracked a smile. "Since when have there been kids on this island?" The nearest young woman responded by slapping the back of his head. "There have always been children in the ordeals. They too have the right to survive. And you had to slap me in the face to say that?" The bald man retorted with an angry, flushed face as he massaged the back of his sore skull with his free hand. The other hand was firmly clutching a kind of claymore. "Easy, easy, easy. How about we focus on the threat ahead?" The fatty laughed while pointing a finger at the enormous triceratops rushing towards them. "Good point." His 3 companions responded to the unison, and a titanic new battle ensued, giving Tim the respite he so badly needed. Chapter 255, to help or not to help. A mass of silvery hair streaked with golden strands emerged on the surface of the water, followed by a young, thoughtful face that exposed a row of translucent fangs as he drew a deep breath. His eyelids were slightly squinted, and his eyeballs moved imperceptibly to record every detail of the scenery. Hey, did someone call me? Jake muttered as he inspected the body of water around him. The island was so far away that the palm trees at the edge of the jungle were virtually indistinguishable from each other. The sky was empty of any flying birds or dinosaurs, and even the murky water in which he was swimming had been practically deserted by its former occupants. It was highly unlikely that a human had called out his name. Maybe I just daydreamed. He shrugged with a small laugh. You were not dreaming. She intervened in a formal tone. The bracelet did record a sound from your hearing. After analysis and comparison with old data, it is 99% certain that it was Tim's voice, and at the tremolo it contained, he was probably in a state of extreme agitation, probably panic. Jake raised his eyebrows when he heard this report, but looking at the island in the distance, there was nothing he could do. Even if he used his telekinesis to reach the shore as quickly as possible, he would then have to face many dangers to find the child. In another context, and if he had been closer to the shore, he wouldn't have minded giving a hand, but in his present situation it was extremely restrictive. Should I go back or not? Jake hesitated reluctantly. It had only been a few hours since he had started farming prey on the open ocean, and he was far from having accomplished the goals he had set for himself. Finding prey worthy of him wasn't as easy as it had been during the first trial. Here, the sea monsters were no longer the products of a simulation, but real living beings with their own motivation and a pronounced survival instinct. If they were not hungry, they were more likely to be ignored by predators, unless they had a territorial character or were of a particularly ferocious nature. However, this did not mean that he had not achieved any results. He had defeated a school of jellyfish, several white sharks, as well as a small megalodon about 15 meters long and a group of swordfish determined to impale it. The only problem was that finding these prey had taken him a considerable amount of time, and they were generally smaller than what he was used to during his first trial. In addition to being physically weaker, their ether stats appeared to be calibrated to the ether density of 40, characterizing this second ordeal. On this aspect, the sea monsters of his first trial were clearly superior. The first megalodon that he had faced in his first trial, for example, was more than 20 meters long. Its skin was covered with an incredibly tenacious layer of stony material, and the quantity of ether inside the creature slightly exceeded the ether density of this world, closer to 50 than 40 points. With these opponents being too weak and unchallenging, his ether stats had barely improved, but he was able to confirm that defeated enemies now gave ether upon their death. However, earning 1 ether point per stat over the 100-point limit still allowed him to increase his advantage over the average players. He didn't know how many players had ether stats over 100 points, but unless they had a high-grade bloodline like his, it shouldn't be that common. His real concern was that his Murtharian bloodline largely owed its grade to its growth potential. Right now, it wasn't that strong. Compared to a normal human, it was certainly a godsend, but compared to bloodline's sacrificing potential for an immediate gain in strength, it was a little too light. For example, there was a grade 2 bloodline in the Oracle store called the Tank, whose only particularity was to confer the passive property, increased toughness LVL1, to the ether of constitution of its holder. This did not overcome the limit of 100 ether points, but multiplied by almost 5 the physical resistance that each point of ether constitution brought. In the long run, if the holder of the bloodline remained unable to overcome this threshold, the effect of the bloodline would gradually become negligible when the other participants became strong enough to rival this ability. But for the time being at least, this made these evolvers unquestionably tenacious. This benefit was nevertheless limited if the body did not follow. For example, with his Murtharian body, Jake had a body that was twice as strong as normal, which was equivalent to doubling each of his stats. In this area alone, his bloodline surpassed this grade 2 bloodline. However, this changed once this grade 2 bloodline advanced to grade 3. Some bloodlines could advance 1 grade at the same time as they increased 1 level. This happened when a new bloodline skill was unlocked during the process. This tank bloodline had the chance to possess a grade 3 version, and in addition to multiplying the physical resistance by 10 instead of 5, it gave a second property to the ether of constitution called shield, whose passive effect covered the skin of its owner with a thin layer of energy protecting it from impacts, heat, and radiation. The renewal of this shield was slow and the energy it contained was limited, but this could definitely allow such a competitor to go very far in this second ordeal. To give an element of comparison, if Jake had had such a bloodline when Lamine and Yerode had ambushed him by surprise, he could probably have withstood the shots from Lamine's sniper without suffering the slightest scratch. In the end, the grade of a bloodline was only an indicator. No bloodline or ether skill could be considered perfect. It depended mainly on the context of each individual and the benefits to be gained from it. You should at least see if he's okay. She suddenly interrupted his reflection while her hologram appeared in front of him walking on the water. Jake, who was lost in thought, grunted in response, but he did not object. After all, considering the length of this trial, checking on the child's well-being would only take a tiny fraction of his time. In addition, there was a simple way to check on Tim's well-being. Using the Oracle system, he wished to locate the child, and his shadow guide quickly began pointing in the direction of the child's location. "He's on the move," she commented in a nonchalant tone. "And he's going rather fast," Jake added, with pursed lips. At that speed, and considering his cry of distress earlier, he was clearly being chased by something. Checking the player rankings with a glance, he remembered that almost all of his comrades were also on the island. If his attempt to seek Jake's help had failed, chances were he had now turned his attention to Sarah, Will, or one of his cousins. Jake didn't really believe in this last possibility, but he knew that the child was in love with Lily, his youngest cousin, and that he had blended in well at the Wilderth's mansion during the few days preceding the ordeal. With some luck, it was not absurd to imagine he was getting along well with some of them. To say how much Jake didn't care about his family, he hadn't even bothered to check if his cousins were on the island. Thank goodness he didn't have to. When he tried to locate Sarah, he discovered that Tim was running precisely in that direction. "Oh, I am amazed. I thought I was pretty original here." Jake sighed as he saw where the young woman was. The shadow guide was pointing to the ocean, several kilometers off the island. The island was more or less spherical, so she was not that far from him if the shadow guide pointed straight to the ocean alongside him. "No, that makes sense," she retorted as if it was obvious. "She has the Myrmidian bloodline, which shares a lot in common with yours. She finished her second trial shortly after you, so it's clear to me that your course is similar and that you approach the ordeal in the same way. Like you, she must intend to boost her ether stats and get better soul glyphs after having stagnated during the first 2 trials." Thinking about it for a few seconds, Jake had to admit that this reasoning made sense. If Sarah had handled the first trial exactly as he did, it was only natural that she would have drawn the same conclusions. Their bloodlines were extremely similar, which reinforced that probability. In this case, I just have to swim in Sarah's direction. That will kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Anyway, at the speed Tim is running at, it is impossible for me to catch him in such a short time. He concluded with a satisfied look on his face. It was the best compromise he could come up with. Chapter 256: The Way of the Krishes. As Jake set out on his long swim to Sarah, the humanoid creature in pursuit of Tim was seething with rage inside, barely holding back from howling its wrath to the entire jungle. This feeble and unimpressive prey had been driving it crazy for almost half a day, forcing it to waste an astronomical amount of ammunition and a significant amount of ether. Although this was only a drop in the ocean for its unparalleled Krish body, the same could not be said of its spirit. Using such ether skills repeatedly had severely impacted its mental state, to the point of making its mood unstable, leading to a painful headache. It could have meant giving up chasing this tiny human, as its Krish comrades had done several hours earlier, but that would have been tantamount to admitting that it was inferior to its own prey, whose physical stats were only a fraction of its own. As a member of one of the most feared species in its native universe, to be bullied in this way was nothing more than an unbearable humiliation, which its proud and arrogant personality was unable to tolerate. To carry their weapons inside the second ordeal, including the sanctuary bubble, Most of the Krishas had used their rewards from the first ordeal to purchase a storage space attached to their oracle device, and it was no exception. The space available was limited, in the order of 1 cubic meter, but it was more than enough to hold the food, armor, and weapons they needed. This optional feature occupied one of the free slots of its bracelet, but it gave it a property comparable to the space ring so popular in the cultivation novels. In addition to being able to hold a significant amount of items, its real interest was that this equipment could be taken with them to an ordeal world. This oracle device ability was called dimensional storage space, but was only the most primitive and least expensive form of this functionality. However, getting this reward had cost it almost all of its points from the first ordeal, and knowing that its score was quite decent among the other Krishas, it was an amount that even it was reluctant to spend. It was, however, a worthwhile investment. Even though their race did not fear survival-type ordeals in hostile environments like this one, being able to conserve food, water, and futuristic firearms like theirs gave them a definite advantage. If it wished, it could simply hide somewhere and survive for several months by rationing its food. Even better, it had several valuable artifacts protecting the integrity of its spirit body. In other words, the second trial was no challenge for their species at all. To get through the night, it had simply slept on the beach under the stars, and when it had woken up, it had received the congratulations of the artificial voice and was then dispatched to the island. The artifact it was carrying, which looked like an ordinary black pearl, had changed color several times during the night, its deep black being slightly discolored by the next sunrise, but nothing that the pearl could not withstand. It had 3 more just like these, and that was more than enough to withstand the harmful spiritual influences on this island for several months. It was the guarantee that he could pass this third trial without exerting the slightest effort. Tim, for example, had to take inconsiderate risks every day to ensure his next meal or find a place to sleep. It was precisely because of this that he had finally come across the 3 Krish aliens. If he had had these supplies and pearls when he first arrived on the island, he would definitely never have ended up in such a precarious situation. However, it was unrealistic to think that everyone could have drawn such an advantage from this storage space. For the majority of species, compromising the growth of their power or knowledge for such an accessory was extremely risky. Moreover, ordeals were not intended that way. Using objects that were not authorized through the normal entry route could be treated as a form of cheating, and even if the oracle system turned a blind eye, it certainly went against its original intent. Some extremely wealthy Krishas at the head of large factions had been able to amass colossal amounts of ether long before their first ordeal through subordinates or their own force, and therefore had already the equivalent of a space ring long before their first ordeal. If Jake had been able to take his assault rifle with him during his first ordeal, it could have changed many things. It was then easy to imagine what impact futuristic Krish weapons with such a destructive potential could have. Naturally, many Krishas had attempted it, and the final verdict was that it did not always work. Every ordeal world was protected by a mysterious entity, a kind of will that nothing could defy. Some Krishas thought it was the oracle system itself, while others firmly believed that it was the gods of these worlds, or to go even further, another oracle, which would reject any object, individual, or technology that had no relevance there. Hence, the reason why Jake's appearance and genome had, for example, been temporarily converted into Thrasgenian during the time of the ordeal. A gun appearing in a world still in the Bronze Age could only be rejected by the oracle or the gods of this world following this logic. Obviously, all this was pure speculation. It could also simply be a form of protection for the participants. In the ordeal world to which Jake had been sent, it should not be forgotten that heroes like Mermid, Kinther, Thrasgen, or Elter existed. The appearance of such weapons or an unknown species would undoubtedly have attracted their attention, which could have had dire consequences. The conclusion of all these experiments was that in the end, not all the weapons and objects contained within the bracelet could pass through the customs embodied by the red cube. At best, there were restrictions, or at worst the object could not be retrieved from the bracelet during the ordeal. A restriction could, for example, change the appearance of a 20th century machine gun to that of a musket or bow of equivalent quality to respect the theme of an ordeal. The power of the weapon might be severely affected by these changes, but it was always better than nothing. Above all, Food and water were never denied, and clothing would always be converted to the fashionable attire of these worlds. It was therefore unscrupulously that the Krishes cheated in this way by taking advantage of their technology. For if the Oracle was really against their method, it was perfectly capable of stopping them from using it. Luckily, this sanctuary bubble had not refused the contents of its bracelet. In addition to accepting its electromagnetic rifle, equipped with a plasma cannon that could be recharged directly with its ether, its armor was also accepted, as well as all its other accessories. This second ordeal seemed to have no interest whatsoever in their preparation, considering it as part of their own strength. Back to the subject. In its frantic pursuit of Tim, the Krish had exhausted all its ammunition, and to reload its weapons several times, it had wasted a good portion of its energy. It was for this reason that when suddenly the call for help rang out from miles around, the Krish almost cried with joy, its mandibles stuck to his lower jaw, clicking excitedly. Jake! Jake! Ache! 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 Suddenly raising its head straight in front of it, a predatory smile appeared on the Krish's mouth full of teeth. Its mouth resembled a bottomless well, lined with multiple rows of teeth, and its smile gave the illusion that its jaw was dislocated. The mandibles glued to its mouth opened fully at the same time, giving the impression that its smile had spread its wings and was about to fly away. He's over there. The Krish roared with jubilation. Grabbing its plasma rifle, which it had reloaded with great difficulty, it fired without hesitation 2 high-energy bursts to vaporize the vegetation in front of it. The trees remaining near the beach were no longer tall enough or leafy enough to obstruct its path. Rushing like a lunatic, the Krish's vision grew narrower as if it had just entered a tunnel under the effect of the excitement. All it could think of was the image of its prey roasted and impaled from mouth to anus on a homemade spit. Just thinking about it, its mouth was already watering. In this state of mind, the roars and cries of other local predators were only an insignificant background noise, and it did not occur to him that a fearsome predator had also been provoked by the child's call for help. Thus, as it was about to leap out of the jungle to find its target, the earth began to shake, pulling it out of its trance. A split second later, a huge explosion blasted it away, followed by agonizing pain in its crotch. A piece of palm trunk weighing several hundred kilos, blown away by the explosion, had just hit it in the balls. And yes, this it was he. Chapter 257 The Persistence of a Krish. Crouching miserably, his hands covering his genitals, the Krish's mandibles clacked non-stop in a vain attempt to stifle the pain he felt. The blast of the explosion had thrown him more than 50 meters from his former position, and an enormous palm trunk had pulverized his testicles without giving him any chance to react. Without his absurdly robust Krish morphology, he would surely have passed out in the face of such pain, before falling into a deep coma that would ultimately have ended in his death. Meanwhile, the giant Triceratops bull, totally unaware of the existence of this tiny vermin who was nothing more than one of its many collateral victims, had already changed direction to continue to pursue the child who had provoked it. The sound of the monster's trampling, as well as the earthquake, quickly lost its intensity as the creature disappeared into the distance, leaving the indignant Krish to die. A few minutes later, when the pain became tolerable again, the feverish Krish managed to get up. His enthusiasm for the hunt had subsided considerably, and a fluid of dubious consistency was leaking from his crotch. The blood of his species was yellowish, but from the granular appearance of the discharge, it was clear that it was not all blood. The alien's massive penis was nowhere to be seen. Growling guttural grunts repeatedly, the Krish struggled to focus in order to access the storage space of his bracelet. With a thought, he pulled out a few pills the size of a pea, which he gobbled. Discovering his condition, the Krish almost fainted on the spot. His species had insectoid origins and could regenerate the non-vital limbs with sufficient rest, but it was a long process, comparable to that of the chrysalis of a butterfly. If he decided to regenerate the lost limb right now, it would probably take him 2 weeks to a month, during which time he would not be able to move and would be oblivious to his environment. It was a process that he could not control and had to be prepared in advance and preferably in a safe place. If his life was not threatened, he was not ready to take such a risk. By forming a cocoon, He was guaranteed to be able to restore his body and even come out stronger from this catastrophe. But if he actually did that, he would be giving up his chances of performing well during this ordeal. Clenching his teeth, the Krish cleaned his wounds and let his high vitality do the rest of the work. Controlling his ether, a green light built up in his crotch and some healing took place, but his manhood was definitely lost. It's all because of this kid. He raged inside, his hatred for his prey having reached new heights. Taking revenge on the real culprit, the Triceratops, was a futile dream. It wasn't impossible, but it would require a lot of effort on his part. Moreover, given the sheer power of the untamed dinosaur, the final outcome was more than uncertain. A misplaced horn or tail strike, and he would be lucky if he survived the blow. Nevertheless, he was not an elite Krish warrior for nothing. While an average individual would probably have gone crazy or been moping and sobbing in a state of post-traumatic stress disorder, he had, by contrast, already regained his composure. Calmly analyzing the previous events, he realized that he had acted too rashly. He could not communicate with humans, since the Krishes had no vocal cords, but he had oracling notions and could easily guess the intentions of his target based on the intonations of his voice. It was as if he was calling someone. What was it again? Jake. He couldn't confirm whether it was a first name, a code name, or just another word in a language he didn't know. But knowing that his prey was ready to reveal his position with such a loud cry, it was very likely his only chance of survival. The Triceratops was certainly not the individual the child had called out, or the child would not have run away in an even greater panic than he already felt. It meant that his prey had failed regardless of who or what the child had tried to call for help. With renewed bravery and ambition, the Krish slowly began to jog again, gradually accelerating as the pain in his crotch disappeared under the painkillers he had just taken. His journey proved to be much easier than he had expected. The giant dinosaur had trampled trees and brambles, and a bulldozer couldn't have done much better. A royal road was now laid out just for him. In a few minutes, he significantly reduced the small lead that his prey had managed to widen. But just when he thought he would reach his target in no time, a gust of wind, followed by the sound of an explosion, hit him head-on, forcing him to get down on one knee. His multifaceted yellow eyes missed no detail, and he understood in the blink of an eye what was happening. The dinosaur responsible for his injuries was fighting several enemies, and apparently, he had found opponents worthy of it. Several times per second, deafening collision sounds could be heard, always followed by violent shock waves. Trees were destroyed, mammals, reptiles, and other blue-blooded dinosaurs were abruptly brought out of their lethargy, forced to flee their former habitat. Having learned his lesson, the Krish left the path created by the Triceratops and set out to bypass the two parties, which were embroiled in a fierce battle. After a while, having almost finished going around them, a new explosion sounded, closer to him this time. Several ancient trees had been deeply damaged by the last collision, and he was able to glimpse, for a brief second, a portion of the battlefield. The dinosaur was as terrifying as he expected, probably strong enough to give their leader a hard time. But when he saw its opponents, he could not help but shudder with hatred. It was not his prey, but they were of the same species. Were they the allies he had tried to contact with his cry? It was quite possible, but if so, where had his prey gone? However, his shadow guide indicated that he was moving in a very different direction. Clearly, the child hadn't stopped running. Was it because his allies were willing to sacrifice themselves to ensure his escape? Impossible. In any case, it was no longer his business. Like all the Krishes, he cared about his honor and was particularly arrogant, even for those of his kind. However, this did not mean that he was suicidal. Look at these guys. Even the chubby guy, whose jovial expression betrayed a peaceful and friendly character, was able to punch uppercuts hard enough to stop the Triceratops' charge in its tracks. At each collision, he would be pushed backwards, forced to take a few steps back. His body was bruised, and dried blood had dripped from his lips and nose. But it was still an incredible feat. At least he didn't think he could do it. What kind of skill or bloodline is he using? He wondered restlessly. He was even more determined to bypass the area as quickly as possible to continue chasing the child. Just when he was asking himself this question, a die pierced his eardrums, and he saw an almost naked bald man fall from the sky, smashing a heavy claymore on the monster's neck. The sharpness and force of the blow was insufficient to decapitate the monster, but the Triceratops' front paws sank into the ground to cushion the shock. Roar! When provoked, the Triceratops abruptly reared its head up, sending back into the air the insignificant insect that had tried to injure it. The bald man was struck accidentally by one of the horns of the monster, and a spurt of blood accompanied his takeoff. It has at this point that the Krish noticed a woman in armor crouched on the ground further away. Her face was pale, and she was missing an arm. She has clearly been incapacitated. Realizing that this fight was not as simple as he thought, the Krish hurriedly withdrew his attention from the battlefield and fled from the scene. A moment later, the muffled sounds of the battlefield were far behind him, and he had finally returned to his starting point. The child was ahead of him, and the same annoying creepers and brambles were in his way. But at least he knew that this time his prey had no one left to rely on. He had been impatient, which had led to the disgrace he was in, but now he had regained his cool. This prey was undoubtedly worthy of him, and he had to treat it as such from now on. The Krish, carried by his delusions, resumed the hunt for the child, empowered by his latest experiences, to Tim's utter dismay. Chapter 258, The Untrustworthy Shadow Guide. Since Jake's arrival on the real island and the beginning of his third trial, only a few hours had really passed, and it was still only past noon. The sun was at its zenith, and without his tanned skin, he would have been facing the risk of dangerous sunstrokes. The temperatures on the island in the middle of the day were indeed scorching, and very few animals were willing to leave the jungle with milder temperatures. Besides the influence of the three mysterious minerals affecting the mind in different ways at night, the quietness of the fauna during the day could also be attributed to this unbearable heat. For the time being, Jake had nothing to fear. He was surely one of the few participants originally human to be totally indifferent to the radiation emitted by this artificial sun. For the other Earthlings, it was their high constitution and vitality that allowed them to endure this hostile climate. If they were among the weaker players whose stats had been artificially inflated to match the ether density of 40 points, it was a safe bet that this ordeal must surely be painfully hard to endure. Right now, Jake was swimming alongside a group of ichthyosaurs, a prehistoric reptile whose appearance could be reminiscent of a dolphin, except that their average size was about 20 meters long, the smallest being not less than 10 meters. They were not aggressive towards him, and he decided to ignore them as long as they continued to meddle in their affairs. Their behavior was different from the first trial where literally all the ocean animals wanted him dead. With each pull of his arms, an incredible thrusting force was generated and his body was propelled 7 or 8 meters forward. It was a crawl that no professional swimmer could hope to match, its speed approaching that of a jet ski. His swimming speed had increased considerably during the first trial, and obtaining a soul glyph doubling his hydrodynamics had further accentuated this phenomenon. Now that his physical and etheric stats were slowly starting to climb again, the quality of his crawl was improving by the minute. Once you became a Murtharian, it was for life. You had to eat Murtharian, think Murtharian, and act Murtharian. Each act was a personal challenge, and swimming towards Sarah and Tim was no exception. Even if there was no prey suitable for him, he could always challenge himself by pushing his own limits. This served as a good workout, while allowing him to activate the self-growth properties of his bloodline. In addition, with the green soul stone embedded in the handle of his brand new machete, he had access to a constant flow of energy to refresh his mind. Not only did he have finer and finer control over his telekinesis, but he also exhausted himself at a much slower rate. Taking advantage of this new asset, he was making use of his psychic faculties to assist the movements of his body, which allowed him to reach a speed close to that of the most fearsome marine predators of the sanctuary bubble. From time to time, Jake would take a deep breath and attempt a long free dive to explore the seabed. But unlike the first test where he could be resuscitated if he failed, he was no longer able to take such a risk. Long before he reached the limits of his breath or was exposed to any danger, he would stop his descents and return to the surface, breaking his previous record by only a small margin. The marine wildlife was no longer exactly the same, and although he was confident that he could reach the sea floor and come back unharmed, he could not be certain. Yet, Jake had not given up on achieving this feat. Reaching the ocean floor was one of the exploration challenges offered by the sanctuary bubble, and depending on the depth, the rewards were different. There were a whole series of exploration missions with tempting rewards, the first prerequisite of which was indeed to be able to reach the bottom. Jake didn't care much for those feats whose reward consisted of a few ether points. Even though he had chosen to return to the ocean to slaughter marine predators, it was mainly because he knew the creatures that inhabited it well, and because it offered him a golden opportunity to improve his stats. The ether granted by the hunting feats were just a nice bonus. On the other hand, missions whose rewards displayed were much more attractive, and she shared this opinion too. The objectives were often unclear and vague, but after receiving 2 soul glyphs, he knew it was worth it. It could make him stronger immediately, fixing one of his shortcomings. Inhaling deeply again, Jake closed his eyes and sank beneath the surface of the water, his body fearlessly venturing into the abyss. He passed the 100, 200, and 300-meter depths without encountering any major enemies. The soul glyph, Apex Ocean Predator, was incredibly effective at intimidating sea creatures. Perhaps too much so. That fish, moray eels, and other piranhas were frightened was not a surprise, but that even most sharks, crocodiles, and other sea monsters would choose decisively to escape clearly compromised the effectiveness of his hunt. At least he could move around without being hindered by anything. But the plain truth was that Jake was hoping to stumble upon a real badass to test his limits. He was convinced that there must be all kinds of abominations at the bottom of this ocean, but despite his best efforts he had never come across them. Even on Earth, there were many legends about the existence of such monsters, and some scars found on sperm whales would suggest that there were squids of gigantic proportions in the abyss. It was nonetheless unverifiable, and nowadays it was simply part of the folklore. However, after having confronted mosasaurs and megalodons, Jake was much more inclined to believe in their existence. All of a sudden, his spirit body deployed more than 20 meters around him sent him an unexpected feedback. His field of extrasensory perception had just been touched by something, and the little that he had detected suggested that it was a colossal ether mass. What was that? Jake momentarily stopped swimming to probe the darkness around him. The water at this depth was dense and still, and the slightest movement would induce currents that were extremely simple to detect with his present senses. Holding his breath, he waited a few seconds in the hope that the monster would reappear, but the water around him remained static and his spirit body did not detect any activity. Paradoxically, his shadow guide was already recommending him to return. Too bad, I guess it's not my lucky day. He was about to begin his ascent to the surface when his body started to jerk in all directions, as if he had just been hit by some violent underwater waves. Before he had time to react, a gigantic ether mass entered his field of perception again, and when he saw the thing behind this etheric signature, he almost died of a heart attack. Damn it! What the fuck is that thing? Jake screamed out, letting a flood of bubbles out of his mouth. Boom! The sound of a huge blast was heard several hundred meters below the surface, and a blood-covered Jake shot through the surface like a rocket a few seconds later. His breath was wheezing and his chest had caved in several centimeters, as if his rib cage had just been smashed by a large hammer. His sternum was fractured into several pieces as well as most of his ribs, but his machete had held firm. Without his machete, he probably would have been killed instantly. Roar! Muffled by the hundreds of meters of water between them, the roar of the monster still rippled through his eardrums as the murky water on the surface began to undulate eerily. Knowing that he was not out of the woods, Jake unhesitatingly abandoned his previous plan. With his life at stake, he followed the advice of his shadow guide faithfully and activated his telekinesis to fly away. For a minute, he flew as fast as he could towards the shore, quickly exhausting his mental forces before dropping back a few miles away when he was certain that the sea monster had given up chasing him. From the beginning to the end of the interaction, he had never had a clear picture of the creature, but he was sure of one thing. Against such a monster, he was as insignificant as a flea. The ether levels of this thing were higher than his, and he had only felt such pressure twice. The time he had met Mermid at the end of his first ordeal and during the fight between the lion and the rank 7 digester. The most shocking thing was that his shadow guide had reacted a little late. If the shadow guide was working properly, in order to protect him from danger, his course would have circumvented the monster. Instead, he had gone straight for him. Such a monstrosity was far beyond what he expected to face during this ordeal, and it called into question his entire strategy. No wonder that the rewards of these exploration missions were rewarded with question mark, because the Oracle itself had no idea of the risks involved. Chapter 259 Jake's Enlightenment. Cough, cough, fuck. Jake swore after yet another retching that ended in a cough of blood. His crushed rib cage had damaged many organs and arteries, including his lungs and heart. With his constitution and vitality, he could withstand such a level of damage, but the fractured and sharp bones of his ribs and sternum were pricking his muscles and organs with every movement, gradually flooding his punctured trachea. As he struggled to reach the shore, his vision gradually blurred as he was losing blood and his oxygen level kept dropping dangerously. His limbs were getting heavier and his dyspnea was getting worse by the second. No, it won't do. If he continued like this, he would faint in the next few minutes, long before reaching the beach. If this happened while he was still in the water, the tragic conclusion would undoubtedly be his drowning. Gathering what little consciousness he had left, Jake actively controlled his ether to perceive the inside of his body. He was not a doctor, but he had notions, and with an intelligence and perception like his, it was not difficult for him to examine himself and act accordingly. His indigo ether of perception concentrated on his brain, rib cage, and relevant nerves to amplify his sensory input, and the condition of his bones, organs, arteries, and veins soon became clear in his mind. After that, he used his telekinesis to connect his pieces of broken bones together, and he concentrated all of his green ether of vitality in the affected areas to force an accelerated healing process. With an ether of vitality greater than 100 and his Mertherian body, his healing speed was already more than 20 times faster than normal, and by condensing his ether to such an extreme, he effortlessly managed to boost it tenfolds. The initial consolidation phase, which would have taken at least 4 to 6 weeks, could thus be reduced to a few hours, but these few seconds were enough to at least get him out of this critical situation. Although his bones were still very brittle, they no longer pierced his vital organs, and he was no longer at risk of malformations. He could finally concentrate on the blood filling his lungs and preventing him from breathing. Again, using his telekinesis, he redirected this partially clotted blood to his esophagus so as not to sacrifice any nutrients. His digestive system, which was capable of metabolizing even metal, set itself in motion and the whole healing mechanism was activated. Because he had neglected his minor injuries to concentrate on those that directly threatened his survival, the rest of his body was far from being in good condition, since his vitality had been temporarily nerfed at the level of that of a normal human. Instead of foolishly continuing to swim to shore, Jake simply lay on his back in a starfish shape on the surface of the ocean, letting himself be carried along by the waves without making any abrupt movements. The blood that he had coughed on several occasions earlier dispersed little by little, and the tension that had accompanied him gradually faded away, and he felt his mind drowsing. Out of danger, Jake closed his eyes in spite of himself, and as unlikely as it may seem, he fell asleep on the surface of the water about 2 kilometers from the shore. There was something relaxing about the wave action, almost acting like a lullaby. Unfortunately, his respite was short-lived. As the pain was just barely receding and he began to truly relax, he was startled by a sharp pain in his leg. The searing pain was so unexpected that he almost drowned when he swallowed sea water. These sudden movements awakened the pain in his bones and organs that were just starting to recover, and a barely contained groan of pain seeped out from between his clenched teeth. The fangs and claws he usually hid were plainly visible, attesting to the fact that his body and mind were facing a life-threatening emergency. Cough. What attacked me, Jake asked, spitting out sea water one last time, his face pale and ringed. I'm afraid it was one of those little carnivorous fish that we kept encountering during the first trial. The hologram of the young woman responded with a gloomy expression as she appeared before him. On hearing her explanation, Jake was momentarily taken aback. How is it possible? With the sole glyph, apex ocean predator, all these little predators should normally be terrified at my approach and flee as far away as possible. Since the beginning of the third event, I have not actually encountered a single marine creature under 5 meters. She shook her head with a wry smile. That may have been true when you were a match for that soul glyph, but right now you're just a wounded man who's lost a lot of blood. In the wild, hyenas avoid attacking lions, but it is not uncommon for them to devour an old lion isolated from his pack. You are in a similar situation. As threatening as your aura may be, the blood you have lost has betrayed your condition, including the fact that your myrmidian blood must be an intoxicating delicacy for these fish. It's not surprising that one of them has come back so quickly. The really amazing thing is that it's the only one. When Jake listened to She's last words, his face crumbled in horror. Redeploying his spirit body that he was too exhausted a moment ago to maintain, he noticed a multitude of etheric signatures slowly accumulating around him. These fish hadn't attacked yet, but it was obvious that the way they were shortening the distance, their hesitation was gradually decreasing. Before long, this school of prehistoric piranhas would give in to their instincts, and this time he would be attacked by not one, but several thousand fish. Horrified, Jake used his telekinesis with difficulty to extricate himself from the water, and somehow he managed to levitate towards the beach while avoiding any sudden acceleration. Caw, caw. Looking up to the sky, Jake almost fell back into the water when he saw the flock of pterodactyl vultures circling above him. Not once had he seen the tip of their beak since he had stepped back into the water, and now that he was seriously injured, the damn birds had decided to reappear as if by magic. What the hell kind of bad luck was that? Grinding his teeth against each other so loudly that a shrill sound could be heard from several meters away, the arm holding the machete suddenly stiffened. It was clear that it was impossible for him to reach the shore without a fight. Sorry, Tim. You'll have to rely on Sarah to solve your problem, Jake muttered as he let himself fall back into the water. If these creatures thought he had become easy prey, they were cruelly mistaken. Waving to the feathered pterosaurs above him, Jake simply bellowed, "Come." As if their dignity had just been provoked, the 100 or so giant birds circling in the sky uttered their war cry before swooping down on him just like an air missile strike. At the same time, the thousands of carnivorous fishes lurking around him had caught up with him, and they came straight at him together. Attacked by both sea and sky, in spite of the pain, Jake's clenched jaws grinned without warning. As if he had just been enlightened, he felt his ether stats start climbing again much faster than with all the fighting he had endured in the previous hours. To become stronger as a Myrtharian, he needed challenges worthy of him, constantly pushing his limits. He had thought he was just unlucky not to find a worthy predator, but he was wrong. If there was no challenge worthy of him, he could simply handicap himself. In its present state, this struggle against these fish and birds was once again balanced. In addition to being seriously injured and exhausted, his bones were not consolidated and could re-break at the slightest sharp movement. He would therefore have to fight without mobilizing the muscle chains involving his torso, which would considerably reduce his effective strength. His mind being sharpened in the face of this life-threatening ordeal, a psychic wave rippled out of his mind, like an explosion, repelling all the fishes rushing at him. At the same time, with a thrust of his legs, his body leaped out of the water, like a dolphin performing an acrobatic stunt, and with a swipe of his hand, his machete decapitated the two closest pterosaurs. Unable to move his torso, the beak of one of the beheaded pterodactyls kept on falling and stuck itself in his shoulder, but the second one inherited Jake's previous fate by turning into the new fish's feast. The battle had only just begun, but this time there was no room for error. To die was to fail, and for the first time since the first trial, he felt alive. Chapter 260 just a short nap. In the blink of an eye, the huge carcass of the first pterosaur was buried under countless piranhas, while Jake fell back into the water with the beak of the second still stuck in his collarbone. Splash! Splash! Just after he fell back into the water, the carcass of the beheaded second pterosaur collapsed not far from him while lifting a salt water geyser. The shock wave rippled around, generating a series of waves with decreasing power that expelled Jake from the danger zone. Although he had escaped the attention of most piranhas, the rest of the feathered pterodactyls circling in the sky above him began to caw even louder. The death of two of their own had caused them to momentarily retreat, but realizing that the prey had been wounded during this brief altercation, their fighting spirit was instantly reignited. As one, the mortar-style airstrike resumed, and a moment later Jake was again spewing blood after eliminating 3 more giant birds. The blood clogged his bronchial tubes and trachea, preventing him from breathing properly again. The carnivorous fish around him were more than delighted, and had completely given up on the idea of attacking him. Their intelligence seemed at least sufficient to understand that one should not eat a fruitful bait. And this bait was Jake. Each time he re-emerged on the surface of the water, the pterosaurs still alive were furious with their attacks, determined to avenge their fellow creatures. However, Jake was not the type to let himself be shredded without retaliation. With each new round, he would take special care to wound at least one of the birds to death. After a dozen of them had been executed or seriously injured, the area of ocean in which he was swimming had been stained blood red, and other marine predators, much more massive than these fish, were beginning to crowd the area. Sadly, this blood was also partially his own. One of his arms had been speared through the biceps by one of the birds, and one of them had even managed to grab him with its claws for a brief moment. Lifted more than 20 meters high, he had barely managed to free himself by driving the claws of his free hand into that responsible leg. With a loud cry of pain, the monster had released him, and he had landed back in the water with a big splash. Realizing that these swooping strikes were not working at all, the pterosaurs momentarily stopped their attacks to think of a new plan. Jake thought they were too stupid to come up with a parry, but he was wrong. Inspired by their fellow creature that Jake had injured in the leg, the pterosaurs realized that the human was rather vulnerable to this kind of attack. The strong grip exerted by their talons, combined with the length of their claws, made it almost impossible to free oneself. And if successful, he was certain to suffer severe injuries. For example, the previous pterosaur had managed to dig all the talons of his leg into Jake's torso. When the pain had caused it to loosen its grip, the space occupied by those claws had been freed, and an impressive amount of blood had started to escape from it, mixing with the rest of the water. One of his shoulder blades had been pierced, as well as one of his pectorals. One of his lungs had also been punctured, and having already experienced such a death during the first trial, Jake knew that his situation was pretty dire. With his vision blurring again, Jake immediately sensed when he saw the pterosaurs carefully descending a few meters away from him that he didn't stand a chance in this way. Even though the giant birds were flapping their wings and taunting him close to his face, he knew it was a trap. In the best case, he would have maybe enough time to eliminate one of these monsters before being immediately gang-banged by the rest of the flock. A synchronized attack of this type could be executed in a split second by these birds, and unless he was considerably stronger and faster than them, it was not feasible. With the strength of his valid arm alone, it was definitely impossible. Nevertheless, he still had two solutions left: his shadow guide and telekinesis. It was difficult to understand the oracle path instructions when it came to ether manipulations, but it was not necessary either. He knew what he had to do. By flying so low, these pterosaurs had stupidly entered the field of perception of his spirit body. His earlier injuries had baited them, and that was the plan devised by his shadow guide. Otherwise, as tired as he might be, stopping the hearts of these animals would have been just a thought, but their falling would still have wounded him in the long run. Not all the animals on the island were like those hyenas of the second trial, whose red blood corrupted by flinchium gave them a berserk spiritual aura that was inviolable during the night. He had confirmed many times during his first race that these prehistoric birds were nothing special except for their large size and perfect teamwork. Already imagining themselves hacking him to pieces with their beaks and claws, the pterosaurs continued their cautious descent towards him, visualizing their imminent revenge by salivating profusely. This was their final thought. In a split second, Jake's spirit swept through their mental defenses as he took control of their ether, and the next split second, he shut off the power. Their hearts stopped beating, their lungs stopped breathing, and sensory nerve impulses were interrupted. In addition to dying instantly, these birds were plunged into absolute darkness and silence, devoid of all sensation. Although they could have survived for a few more seconds under normal circumstances, this sensory deprivation plunged them into an irrepressible panic. The most distant ones abruptly regained altitude by flapping their wings anarchically, while others bumped into each other, unable to orient themselves correctly. Finally, the vast majority crashed into the water, unable to feel even their own limbs. Naturally, this feat was not so simple to accomplish, or Jake would have used it long ago on the piranhas. These pterosaurs had not all fallen under his mental control at the same time. With a reaction time well above normal and his ability to multitask, he had simply switched from one pterosaur to another at a very high speed. Applying the same prowess to the piranhas was a completely different matter. A school of these fish could hold several 100,000 individuals, and Jake was absolutely incapable, with his present intelligence and perception, to control so many creatures at the same time. On top of that, these fish were relatively small. Perceiving the organs and nerves of these marine animals required a paradoxically much greater effort of concentration than for these enormous flying creatures. Soon there were no pterosaurs left alive except for the few stragglers who were fortunate enough not to enter his mental domain. Almost 100 of these giant birds were lying on the surface of the water in a pool of blood, their number being sufficient to form a small island. Of course, this was temporary. Their feathers soaked with water, the birds that fell first slowly began to sink, if they were not already being devoured by other marine predators lured by all that blood. Such a buffet was hardly ever possible, and all the ocean carnivores for miles around were being drawn in by all that fresh meat. If Jake had been in top shape, he would certainly have used this opportunity to hunt anything that came close, but this time he had to give it up. Looking much more pitiful than when he had first entered the water, Jake's exhausted body dragged itself miserably back to the shore without encountering any new enemies. All of those things who might have wanted to take advantage of his apparent weakness were far too busy sharing the remains of the pterosaurs. He took his time to cross these few miles, leaving his wounds to heal a little. Despite his fatigue, dark circles and pale, drained face, Jake was in a great mood. The ether harvested was not that important, but the increase in his ether stats was a cause for celebration. As a result of such a life-threatening battle, his physical stats had gained almost 8 points, whereas his intelligence, perception, and extrasensory perception had also gained an additional 3 points. His vitality, which has been working non-stop to restore him, had even increased by 10 points. For the moment, he was not feeling the benefits too much, but once he got some rest, the difference would become clear right away. Upon reaching the beach, Jake had the graceful demeanor of an octopus having accidentally strayed out of the water. Without the lift of the water, his body felt awfully heavy, and with the early afternoon sun shining above him, he only had one desire: to sleep. Like a seed being planted into the ground, Jake closed his eyes and, carried by his Murtharian's instincts, he let himself be buried by the burning sand along with his consciousness. "Promised him, it's just a short nap," he murmured in a barely audible tone before blacking out for good. Chapter 261 Dignity. When Jake awoke an unknown length of time later, it was pitch black, and the peace and quiet of the jungle had been replaced by the rabid and frantic cries of the animals under the influence of the red ore. He did not understand previously the nature of these roars and groans, thinking that they were completely commonplace cries in a prehistoric jungle filled with dinosaurs and other alien creatures. However, after surviving an entire night inside, he now had a very different perspective. Every roar seemed tinged with fury, and even the singing of some cicadas had something deeply hostile about it, as if the goal was no longer to sing to seduce and reproduce, but to intimidate and assault. Under the ground, and with his eyelids still closed, Jake could feel the ghostly, greenish light of the soul stone inserted in his machete. There was something reassuring about it, and its gentle energy had certainly helped speed up his mental recovery. Remembering his exhaustion a few hours earlier, he was afraid that he might not wake up at all. He cautiously inspected his body with his senses without making any sudden movements, but he was surprised not to feel any pain or discomfort. Even with his vitality, a few hours were not enough to heal him completely, and yet he had to face the facts. His sternum and ribs were already practically as good as new, and the lost blood had nearly been renewed. Having eaten nothing all day, Jake wondered where his body had gotten those nutrients, but he soon realized that he had simply greatly underestimated his healing skill. The Cantharians were originally a people living on volcanic planets close to their star. These were utterly uninhabitable environments for humans. A grade 7 bloodline was truly no joke. He had expected that the healing process, although perfect, would take a relatively long time, but he understood now that with enough heat, radiation, and minerals, his body could apparently recover from the most serious injuries in no time at all. He didn't know if this was in proportion to his vitality, but it was great news for him. He would now be much less frightened by the thought of injury. With a sudden shake of his body, Jake dislodged himself from his sand sarcophagus and crawled out of his tomb by pushing himself out with his arms. Mobilizing his muscles caused him to tug slightly on his old wounds, but it was still easily bearable. As he dusted off all the damp sand sticking to his body, a huge figure suddenly leapt out of the darkness of the jungle and pounced on him. With a nonchalant gesture, Jake leaned slightly to one side and waved his machete. Shriesh. Whatever it was, this thing was cut in half by his own momentum, and Jake simply jerked his machete after that to get rid of the blood. Blue blood. Jake was surprised to see the luminescent blood slowly seeping into the sand. His curiosity was aroused, and he knelt down near the body to discover that it was a kind of furless panther. Its pink and hairless skin made the beast rather abject, but certainly not frightening. It was comparable in size to a leopard on Earth, and it was the first time Jake had come across such a normal animal since his arrival on this island. Nevertheless, he had no doubt that this creature was dangerous. The monster's fangs emitted the same bluish glow as the blood spilling on the sand, and upon closer inspection of the open maw of the corpse, Jake noticed the presence of venom canals. With his knife, he then easily spotted the venom glands and decided to keep them for some tests. He still used his bracelet to scan the glands and could not help but frown with concern. The venom was extraordinarily powerful. A single drop was enough to kill a dinosaur weighing more than 10 tons. Not those of the Earth, but those of this island. With the ether density being much higher, the constitution and vitality was also incomparable. Comparing his weight to that of the largest dinosaurs on the island, Jake concluded that a bite would have put him into a deep coma within seconds, followed by death within a minute. Of course, that was if he did not take any measures to fight this poison. In practice, he could contract the sphincters in his arteries to slow or even stop the spreading of the poison, and if that wasn't enough, he could always amputate a limb. By concentrating his ether of constitution and vitality in the bite area, he could even fight the poison effectively, but this was alas only speculation. Such a poison was extremely toxic, and the orxanium inside would directly affect his consciousness. The most likely result was that he would probably be delirious long before he could react. With almost no clothing or accessories since his arrival on the island, Jake suddenly became aware that he could not present himself to Tim and Sarah like this. His rags had long since disappeared in the water during the battles, and he was completely naked. No matter how antisocial he was, he had his dignity, and he needed a bag or something similar to carry the venom glands anyway. If he wasn't worried about Tim's situation, Jake would have skinned the panther to make a leather outfit for himself. But contrary to what was seen in many movies or video games, this kind of feat could not be accomplished in minutes or even days. The salting stage alone took several hours, and he didn't even have any salt on him. In other words, he was doomed to remain stark naked for the next few days. He didn't mind when he was swimming or wandering on his own, but he was aware that this could also cause him a lot of trouble. Going barefoot in a jungle where all sorts of poisonous insects and reptiles were hiding in the brush was an invitation to be bitten or stung. In the end, Jake cast a tearful glance at the leaves of a nearby palm tree and resolved to make himself an ugly loincloth using different leaves and grasses from the area. His pride had just suffered a great blow, but at least his private parts were hidden, even though he now had the ugly impression to wear a skirt. So pretty. The hologram of she exclaimed on the side, while observing the result with one of her delicate hands on her mouth, repressing an umpteenth giggle. Jake, who was hardly starting to be satisfied with the result, dropped all that he had in the hands when he heard the soft and sarcastic voice of his AI. A vein pulsated on his forehead, and if he could punch this hologram in the face, he would have done it. Fuck. The first who laughs, I make him eat my loincloth. Jake growled while giving a kick to the panther to let off steam, which took off in the air like a soccer ball after a free kick. After this misadventure, Jake decided to plan his ordeal a little more. Instead of spending all his time in the water, he would from now on devote some of his time to this kind of menial task. He had the required notions for this, and if he did it right, he would have a decent wardrobe in 1 to 2 weeks. As for the venom glands, he had made himself a filthy handbag by felting stems together, and the result was more than debatable. In fact, He wasn't even sure that the object would hold up when traveling underground. In the end, he had to bury his meager loot under a tree so that he could retrieve it later. Naturally, Jake had not forgotten the potential emergency Tim was in. When he woke up, the first thing he had checked was whether the child was still alive, and then his location. He was able to confirm that the boy had likely made it to Sarah. The two were lined up in the same direction, which was highly implausible, unless Tim and Sarah were on the same axis, which was still a possibility. The only thing really surprising was that they were both in the jungle, but it was not absurd either if they didn't have a green stone like him to sleep out in the open. In any case, by surviving so long without help, Jake felt that the child was probably all right. Either he had solved the problem himself, or Sarah had taken care of it. Being the only one to have a Myrmidian bloodline with the self-encoding skill like him, Jake was quite confident in her abilities and character. Kyle had been disappointing, but he knew the young woman was a tough nut to crack since the night before their first ordeal. At last dressed up as the Tarzan of the poor, Jake had barely set off when he heard some ruckus in front of him. It sounded like footsteps, and they seemed to take no precautions at all to conceal their arrival. Intuitively, he would have said there were at least two of them. On high alert, Jake held his machete firmly in his hand and prepared to face the other players, but when he recognized the two newcomers, his jaw almost dropped to his ankles. It was Tim and Sarah. While he was taking his time meticulously knitting a palm leaf loincloth, his two comrades were running stark naked for their lives in a state of filth never seen before. Chapter 262 Awkwardness. A few hours earlier, Tim had finally managed to reach Sarah. Like Jake, Sarah was busy in the water looking for prey to hunt. But unlike Jake, she was only a kilometer from the shore, and Tim's cry had been perfectly audible. Even if she hadn't heard it, his figure was easily recognizable on the beach with her high perception. Curious, the young blonde woman had aborted her hunt and returned to shore empty-handed. At the sight of her, the prepubescent teenager had stiffened in stupor, as if he had just seen something profoundly disturbing. Only then had she remembered that she was naked. After days of fighting in the ocean, the rags provided at the beginning of the first event had obviously not lasted long. However, she hadn't felt embarrassed much more than that. She was very proud of her physique and didn't have any complexes on Earth back then. After she received her Myrmidian bloodline, and with her high vitality eliminating all toxins and impurities, this was even less the case. There was only one predominant feeling deep inside her, and that was absolute confidence. "What are you doing here?" Sarah had asked him suspiciously, peering out into the jungle behind him. Her voice having broken the spell, Tim had come out of his torpor, blushing briefly before the reason for his presence came back to him. Soon, panic had again crept into his face, and the gorgeous figure of the young woman had been relegated to a corner of his head. I'm being chased, and I didn't know what to do." The child had suddenly burst into tears, an act he no longer felt capable of. Sarah had remained calm and indifferent in the face of this emotional outburst, choosing to address the obvious question. "Why me? I'm sure Jake isn't that far away, and he got to the island before me." I've tried." Tim had stuttered with a sheepish stutter. He had then told her about his misery of the previous days, and as she was barely getting the hang of it, the Christian pursuit of the child had finally caught up with them. A violent fight had then broken out between the two parties, with Sarah temporarily managing to compete with the alien who had gone berserk with hatred. Meanwhile, Tim, who had long been terrified and at his wits' end, had taken refuge in the jungle a little further away, hoping for a favorable outcome. Regrettably, that had not been the case. Sarah had no weapons except a makeshift spear and a dagger made of wood and bone. This was insufficient to confront a physically superior alien whose anatomy and equipment gave it an overwhelming advantage. After a few minutes, they had been forced to retreat after her body was lacerated from side to side and her back burned to the 3rd degree by a plasma blast that had grazed her. She had then decisively caught up with Tim by grabbing him under her arm like a cheap parcel and ran away in the direction of Jake. Even though the child didn't dare enter the water to find him, it wasn't a problem for her. As they fled, night had finally fallen and the Krish had continued to harass them non-stop, becoming more and more aggressive, until they finally discovered to their utmost delight that Jake had already reached the shore, saving them a risky night swim. "What are you doing here?" Jake asked, repeating the same question that Sarah had posed to Tim earlier, and trying not to look in the wrong place. Alas, the young woman's generous breasts were a magnet that inevitably captured his gaze, and he was glad that most of her skin was hidden under the dirt, or it would have been much harder. Still, his heart started beating harder, and his veins radiated a soft reddish glow, while a very specific part of his anatomy filled with blood. Sarah's fragrance, a mixture of wet dirt, sweat, blood, and pheromones, assailed his senses in a dizzying way as his breathing quickened dangerously. Fuck, what's happening to me? Jake shook his head as he looked away and tried to visualize the most disgusting image he was capable of. It was only after staring at an imaginary pineapple pizza for a long time that he regained his normal state. Phew, that was close. At that very moment, he had just understood what his bloodline description meant by increased libido. Normally, this would not be a problem, as long as the stimuli were not excessive, but after his nap underground, he was not prepared for such a test of willpower. Ahem. Ashamed, but choosing to pretend that nothing happened, Jake cleared his throat to regain his composure, but in the face of their silence, he realized that something was wrong. Turning his attention back to the pair again, he noticed that Tim was just exhausted and nervous, but the young woman's bosom was rising and deflating suspiciously, and he could even hear her heart beating wildly. Remembering that she had part of the same bloodline as him, he suddenly realized that she had just gone through the same psychological ordeal. Does that mean that I am sexy with a skirt in palm leaf? Jake mumbled in a barely audible voice, but when Sarah heard him, her horny state was immediately dampened by an immense rage. Sexy. My ass is sexy, she retorted, clenching her teeth and barely restraining herself from strangling him. Jake nodded out of habit, but his reaction made her feel like he didn't believe her. And indeed, he had already formed a strong opinion of the young woman's strange fetish. Because he knew at least one thing. If a woman showed up in front of him wearing long socks and flip-flops, he would certainly have vomited in his mouth instead of momentarily losing control of his impulses. A man in skirt was just about the same in his narrow mind. The moment of awkwardness passed, the duo finally recounted their misadventures to him, while starting with the hell that Tim had lived and finishing by their joint escape in front of this terrifying and overarmed alien. So, if I understand correctly, to sum up, a humanoid alien over 2.5 meters tall and looking like some kind of huge human fly in armor with mandibles instead of a trunk and a mouth like a lamprey has been chasing you all day long and should be here any second? That's right, Tim murmured, trembling with fear. Sarah confirmed with a nod in an austere expression. She was not as frightened as the child, and it was thanks to her that he was still alive at this hour, but it was undoubtedly too tough an opponent for her. She doubted that Jake could handle it alone, but by cooperating, they stood a chance. Contrary to what the young woman thought, Jake was by contrast extremely excited to meet this infamous humanoid fly. He had a quality machete boosted by his gray ether, a body probably 3 to 4 times stronger than Sarah's, and extreme confidence in his telekinesis and other ether skills. On the other hand, according to Tim and Sarah, the player in pursuit of them should also have been relatively exhausted from fighting and chasing them for so long and had expended copious amounts of ammunition. Although Jake didn't know how much ammunition this alien had left, the situation was in his favor. Moreover, this alien had apparently not used any ether skill or spell except for the lightning that radiated from his body from time to time, and which seemed to be used mainly to reload his weapon. This player seemed instead to favor physical confrontation and had not shown by its intelligence in spite of its advanced equipment. If this was the case, he had nothing to fear. Hundreds of ambush simulations began to flash through his mind in a matter of seconds, as Jake actively thought about how to eliminate the alien with the least amount of movement possible. Never hesitant, he opted for a surprise attack underground by burying his enemy under a mountain of sand, followed by a full-scale decapitation if smothering him with several tons of sand wasn't enough. Then suddenly, a possibility came to his mind, and he stopped all his planning. If this player's oracle rank was equal to or higher than his own, it was more than likely that its shadow guide would be able to thwart all his tactics, no matter how advanced they were. Worse, if his plan was as perfect as he thought it was and his advantage as great as he thought it was even possible that the flyman might not take the bait at all. By the way, where is it? Jake inquired with a plain face. Taken aback, Sarah and Tim glanced at each other before hesitantly replying. He should be here any time now. You said that a few minutes earlier. It's true, Sarah admitted with a confused expression. Tim was equally baffled. Several minutes passed without either the jungle nor the beach showing any signs of activity. So, where is it now? Jake asked politely again. I don't know. I don't know either. An hour passed, and Jake even took the opportunity to patrol underground in the hope of tracking down the alien, but to no avail. 2 hours later, the trio had to face the facts. The flyman had fled. Chapter 263 Laughs and Grief. Elsewhere on the island, two aliens resembling huge wingless flies, but whose trunks had been replaced by mandibles, were camping around a fire. One of them was taller and wider, nearly 3 meters high, while the other alien was frielier, measuring 3 heads less. These two aliens were the comrades of the Krish who had been chasing Tim throughout the day. The clearing they were in, with its hypnotic green glow of grass, was the same safe zone where the child had first met them. After a day of hunting, the two players had returned here to recuperate and plan their next move. Krish, we've killed 2 other participants. That's not bad, the smaller Krish exclaimed in a cheerful tone. Gulping a leg of lamb weighing several kilos in a few mouthfuls without bothering to chew, the other Krish swallowed with a noisy gulp. Then after drinking a whole gourd of water, he commented in a placid tone. Kryish, that's not bad, but I am worried about Arrogant Warrior. The player ranking indicates that he is still alive, but the fact that he hasn't come back yet, and that his score hasn't moved indicates that it didn't go well. The Krish people had an obscure mode of communication for other races endowed with vocal cords, closer to a kind of high-frequency Morse code than an articulated language. Thus, first names were most often a nickname that suited an individual well. The first part defined their role in society and was decided before birth, when they were still in pre-larval forms, that is to say, as simple eggs. As for the second part, it could change during the course of life, but tended to stabilize after a certain age. To bear such a name, the character of Arrogant Warrior was no secret to anyone. As they were about to put out the fire to sleep, with the leader volunteering to take the first watch, a movement in the bushes caught their eye. Pointing their plasma rifles in the direction of the noise, the 2 alert aliens stood still in that position for a few moments. But when they recognized the newcomer, they couldn't help but let out a small laugh. Krish. Krish? Krish. Mwahaha. What's happened to you? Your deflated face is worth the trip. The smallest Krish mocked openly without trying to spare his ego. The leader inspected him from head to toe with a pursed mouth, dwelling for more than reason on his crotch still covered with dried yellow blood, before looking the newcomer straight in the eyes. Krish? Krish, Krish, Krish. Who did this? It's good that you came home safe and sound, but it makes me curious. Except for the Jackum and the 2 Nosks present, we should be practically invincible on this island. The majority of the participants are human, and few human races are a danger for us, especially in a second ordeal. Hearing the mockery of the other female Krish as well as the worried tone of his superior, the fists of Arrogant Warrior tightened so hard that a crack of articulation as loud as a firecracker resounded in the clearing. But in front of his leader, he could not afford to be disrespectful. Hierarchy took precedence over everything else for the Krishes. Krish, I did indeed fail, and that child has been driving me crazy all day, I admit it. However, I don't regard it as fruitless. What I experienced today is a valuable lesson that I won't soon forget. What a sore loser, his 2 comrades thought inwardly as they listened to this grandiloquent speech. Soon he would try to make them believe that he had sacrificed himself for the greater good of the Krishes. And indeed, he did not disappoint. Krish. The human child was indeed weak, but I knew right away that something was wrong with him. That's why I insisted on continuing the hunt. Arrogant Warrior continued his diatribe with the fervor of a man of faith, whose only raison d'etre was the interests of the Krish nation. I was able to determine that he has an incredible sense of danger, certainly the result of an ether skill, but above all an incredible luck. I have tripped more times today than I have in the last 10 years, not to mention my rifle jammed twice when I had a chance to deal him the final blow. The Krishes couldn't frown, as they didn't have any eyebrows, and their facial muscles were also very limited, but there was a sense of skepticism in the other 2 aliens. As for Arrogant Warrior, if such a discipline existed, he could very well have won an Oscar for Best Actor. His verve and false patriotism was spot on. As Arrogant Warrior told them the rest of his adventures, the expression of the other two Krishes became more and more gloomy. The atmosphere became heavy, their breathing becoming shorter and shorter, until he began to discuss the reason for his return. Krish, if I understand correctly, the leader recapitulated by massaging his temples. A group of 4 humans stronger than you confronted an island monster that was even stronger than them, preventing you from catching up with the child. But these 4 humans were not his comrades. Krish. That's right. Krish. After that, the child joined another female human who took his side, but she wasn't strong enough to measure up to you, and they fled again, retracing their steps. The chase was going well, but suddenly your shadow guide changed his mind and ran away in our direction. You also confirm these words. Arrogant Warrior nodded in unabashed fury. Seeing his reaction and based on his character, these emotions were sincere and he had no reason to lie to them. The leader remained silent for a few seconds, sifting through every detail, looking for something he might have missed, and then all of a sudden he got it. Krish, you said earlier that the child shouted in the middle of the day, didn't you? Otherwise you would have lost much more time before reaching him. And he still took that risk, to the extent of attracting another island monster that not even we can defeat easily. In this case, the answer is simple. He called someone for help, but that person was busy or too far away and could not come in time. By retracing their steps later, the 2 humans managed to join him this time. Did you see this person? The third Krish shook his head helplessly. Krish, from far away, for a brief second. All I can say is that this is another human, a rather large male adult for their species. Very proactive in hunting me. Krish, are we going to attack them? Arrogant Warrior then asked in an almost begging tone. His heart was crying out for vengeance with all its might. His leader looked at him for a long time, lost in thought, before replying firmly. KRSH, no. In a completely different section of the island hundreds of miles away from Jake or the Krish trio, another group of wounded humans walked with an expression full of disappointment and regret into another clearing cloaked in a protective greenish halo. This was the group of humans who had confronted the mutant Triceratops. But instead of 4, as before the battle, there were only 3. The bald and muscular man, as well as the short and chubby man, were respectfully carrying the corpse of one of the young women. In this clearing, there were several humans of various looks and characters. Beautiful women in armor, a veteran close to retirement, and other talented young humans. Most of them were carrying a killing intent comparable to the Krish trio, the old man even surpassing them. But the one who shone forth in the midst of this group, like a polished diamond among the pebbles, was a petite young woman of rare beauty, whose long hair was as white as eternal snow. Her left eye was a deep marine blue, while the right one was amethyst-colored. If Jake had met her here, he certainly wouldn't have recognized her, and yet he had met her once before, several months earlier in the VR center where he worked. Indeed, this girl was Ruby Hale. What happened? The young woman snarled in a bossy tone as she waved her hand. Following this gesture, the corpse of the deceased young woman escaped from the hands of the 2 saddened men and floated straight to her. Checking the wounds, she barked curtly. Speak. The bald man complied, and the rest of the group listened silently to his story before bursting into laughter in front of the shocked trio of survivors. Well done for that bitch. She who likes things long and hard. I guess she got what she wanted. Ha ha. Truly, if anyone foreign to the group had witnessed this scene, it would have been hard to believe that these young men and women could barely hold on to tears. Geniuses were just different. Chapter 264 Change of Plan. Returning unsuccessful, Jake's head protruded out of the ground with a disappointment that could not be concealed. Looking up, his eyeballs almost popped out when his gaze was caught directly by a tantalizingly captivating canyon. Sarah, unaware of his return, was standing right above him with a worried expression on her face, her legs slightly spread apart. Noticing the head sticking out of the ground, Sarah kicked it brutally by reflex, before leaping backwards, crossing her legs with indignation in order to hide her private parts. With a dripping nose, Jake closed his eyes for a few seconds until the pain subsided before blowing his nose by squeezing each nostril with his thumb. A spurt of half-clotted blood escaped from each nostril, and a while later he was finally able to breathe properly again. The young woman's toenails, on the other hand, deserved a chisel stroke. At this point, they were truly lethal weapons. If he hadn't moved slightly, she could very well have popped him in the eye. Pulling himself up as if nothing had happened, Jake crossed his arms in a nonchalant pose before simply refocusing the discussion on what truly mattered. "He's gone," he announced solemnly. "No matter how hard I run after him with my shadow guide, I still can't meet the alien you've described. He is already far away." Phew. Sarah and especially Tim heaved a long sigh of relief when they heard the good news. For Sarah, it was just a tough opponent who had thwarted her plans for the day, but for the child, it was the end of an endless nightmare. Joining Jake was the right choice. "If you don't mind, I'm going to continue whatever I was doing," Jake babbled, his eyes wandering. He wasn't that embarrassed by his appearance or theirs, but he wasn't comfortable with it. Furthermore, being a bodyguard wasn't his primary aspiration either. Saving them from time to time or giving them a helping hand to assist them was still acceptable, but sacrificing his progress by putting up with 2 deadweights throughout the 3rd trial was out of the question. On this point, he had not changed much. Moral, fair, but still somewhat selfish and individualistic. "Can we stay with you?" Tim asked with hopeful stars in his eyes. After his misadventures, he knew when to cling to a lifeline at all costs. If he let go of Jake's thigh, he was sure to relive the same hell over and over again. Sarah wasn't particularly against Jake's proposal, but she was worried about the child. If Jake really refused to stay with them, she would have no choice but to stay with the boy. And if an enemy like this alien attacked them again, they might not be so lucky. "It doesn't bother me that much," Sarah interjected calmly. But this alien was not alone. After this failure, he may call for reinforcements. For that reason alone, it's best not to split up. She had a point. That was the main reason she wasn't so excited about going back hunting on her own. No matter how big the island was, if one didn't have one of the highest oracle ranks on the island or an oracle cloaking device, it was impossible to hide forever. It was okay if the other players were unaware of their existence, but via the player ranking and the recollection of their appearance, it was extremely easy to formulate an oracle path to track them down. When Jake heard this argument, he frowned, but he didn't immediately decline. It was a valid reason. Having the highest oracle rank in the trio, and knowing that the alien had 2 comrades according to Tim's testimony, he requested to find his first and then his second ally separately. He had enough details about their physical appearance to make an accurate wish. Unsurprisingly, the shadow guide began pointing in a certain direction, assuring him that the oracle rank of one of the other 2 aliens was not superior to his own. But when he tried to locate the second, the shadow guide did not appear. Clearly, either the oracle rank of one of the aliens was higher than his, or it had an accessory or bracelet function that allowed it to counter this tracking. In other words, if this alien, who was bound to be the strongest of this trio, decided to ambush him, he had no way to hide, nor could he plan anything against this individual. His only hope remained a frontal confrontation, but there again this enemy would have the advantage of being able to anticipate his movements via its shadow guide. Unless he had overwhelming physical and technical superiority, it was a fight he could not win. "Fuck," he snorted as he realized that this brief altercation had literally screwed up all his plans. By abandoning Tim and Sarah, he was also putting himself in great peril. "What race was it?" Jake asked abruptly, as he recalled Tim's description. With enough clues, he might be able to identify them through the player ranking. "No idea." The child shrugged his shoulders with a wry smile. But they had a strange way of communicating, a kind of compulsive krish-krish-krish sound that was horribly unpleasant to listen to. Oh, Jake's eyes lit up. It turned out that 3 of the top players in the rankings matched that profile. With a leader with an oracle rank of at least 6, it wouldn't be shocking at all that they could be ranked so high. After all, to get such an oracle rank after only one ordeal, one would have to accumulate more than 400 rating points if the player had not slaughtered a significant amount of digesters beforehand. If Jake knew more about the ordeal's reward conditions, he probably could have eliminated digesters until he secured a rank 4 before entering the red cube for the first time. The number of points required to reach these ranks were not too high, and with 300 rating points, he would have gained 3 more ranks, allowing him to move up to rank 7. In hindsight, this was surely the method used by the Earth government to give a decisive advantage to their elite troops. With sufficient military and technological support, it was not difficult to reach Oracle rank 4 or 5. Nevertheless, if he had to do it over again, he probably would have made the same choices. Rank 4 digesters were not so rare on B842, and it only took one bad encounter to end up as monster poop. And unlike the first ordeals, the deaths on B842 were final. Some lucky players like Liu Yin had the additional privilege of having a starting Oracle rank higher than the rest of the population, either because they had an exceptional talent that the Oracle system acknowledged, or because they had accomplished something before that had allowed them to get bonus points. Seen like that, an Oracle rank 6 or 7 was not that great. Thinking long and hard about all the possibilities, Jake remained silent for several minutes, pacing back and forth before abruptly changing the subject. By the way, why are you covered in mud? It was a question he had been wondering about for some time. At first, he thought the chase had forced them to wade through mud, but their story didn't mention crossing a swamp, and the dry jungle floor was evidence that it hadn't rained for several days. From the way the partially dried mud was spread, this was probably intentional. It was Sarah's idea, Tim remarked without further explanation. Turning his sight to the young woman, she then explained how she had managed to get through her second trial. You're saying that just by covering yourself with soil and moistening it with seawater, you managed to spend a night on the island? Jake repeated in awe. That's right. Not one to settle for a vague statement. Jake scanned the soil and seawater with his bracelet before coming up with a theory. He already knew that the jungle floor contained traces of flintium, orxanium, and naquat. He had thought the quantities of naquat were insufficient, but apparently this seemed to have a protective effect sufficient to neutralize the action of the other two minerals. As for the seawater, since his arrival on the island he had not needed to analyze it, and the scan immediately confirmed what he thought. There were none of the 3 minerals in the ocean section he had scanned, but the report indicated that this water had been regularly exposed to radiation from a huge naquat deposit. Remembering the huge block of metal at the bottom of the ocean that had prevented him from reaching the shore by the underground road, as well as the fact that none of the animals in the ocean behaved differently at night, an improbable idea came to his mind. Could it be that the entire ocean floor rests on a gigantic soul stone? Chapter 265 New Techniques. If that was really the case, this island was not as simple as it seemed. This naquat had exceptional properties from which he had already benefited greatly. Even if his spirit body was 100 times stronger, the aura emitted by the green soul stone would still nourish him even though it was just a gem packed with impurities. He dared not imagine what incredible energy such a large nugget could harbor. Although he was impressed by Sarah's meticulousness and boldness in finding such a solution, Jake was nevertheless glad to have found a much less restrictive alternative. After hearing the solution found by the young woman, he listened to Tim's solution, which was very close to his own, except that instead of finding a green soul stone, he had simply found a clearing with vegetation growing on a soil very rich in this mineral. He couldn't be certain, but after his recent findings and deductions it was more than likely. Tim having kept the secret of his Baskirian bloodline, Jake could only conclude that the child was incredibly lucky, although he still didn't know if such safe havens were rare or not within the island. He then told them about his own experiences, as he pointed to the stone embedded in the pommel of his new machete. Tim, who knew nothing about the magic behind these safe zones, was shaken to learn that all these miraculous phenomena were due to mere stones, but Sarah's focus was elsewhere. Far from caring about the soul stone, which she could simply take the time to find now that she knew what to look for, the machete in Jake's hands was far more interesting. Did you forge that weapon yourself? She inquired with some disbelief. Even though she had seen him manipulate and melt the earth before to make a container, forging a weapon was a whole different story. If that was the case, she had to make sure that he would craft one for her. Seeing her excited reaction, Jake smiled. Not particularly showy and always keeping a low profile, he wasn't averse to showing off once in a while. Raising his hand in front of him, palm facing the ground, a pile of sand rose up, spinning faster and faster until it collided with each other. His veins began to glow, and an intense heat began to radiate from his body before concentrating at the palm, channeling his power. Soon, the sand began to melt, and a rudimentary machete with a glass-like appearance began to take shape. Feeling that the weapon might be too brittle, he added the dry jungle soil to the mixture so as not to stray too far from his previous recipe. He then controlled his ether to maintain the cohesion of the lava in its new form until it cooled sufficiently. Like Jake's machete, this gladius-shaped sword was as black as obsidian, with a rough texture and no semblance of professionalism. But once he infused it with 100 points of gray ether, the sharpness and sturdiness of the blade instantly reached the level of his own machete. There, it's done. Jake laughed as he made the sword float to her with a leisurely wave. Thank. It cost me 500 ether points, though, to produce all that sharpening ether, so don't forget to pay me back when you can. Jake interrupted her words of thanks with a tone of urgency, as if he feared that she might forget to repay him for his ether in the future. Sarah, who was about to express her heartfelt thanks, felt deeply stifled inside and regretted having thought for a single moment that he was caring for her. Like Will, Jake seemed to follow the adage, short reckoning makes long friends, and only on rare occasions would he appear to be generous. All right, she mumbled with a dry throat as she placed her bracelet against his to complete the transfer. Seeing that his 500 ether points were back, Jake nodded in approval. Now that he knew she was reliable, he wouldn't mind assisting her further in the future, even lending her larger amounts of ether. Upon seeing his relieved face, as if she had just returned his family heirloom to him, a sudden urge to kick his face again took over her mind. Jake then gently asked Tim what kind of weapon he wanted, with a caring tone totally absent from the one he had for Sarah, and after hearing his requirements, he made a heavy double-edged axe for the child. He was more than reluctant to forge such a weapon for a kid of this age, but the child insisted that it was the weapon he was most comfortable with. His first ordeal being different, he could only take his word for it. After all, there were all kinds of different civilizations, and it was quite possible that the world he had landed in favored this type of weapon over swords or spears. So, what's the plan now? Sarah asked with raw resentment as she saw that Jake had not asked the child to pay. This was not because Jake did not want to charge him, but because he subconsciously saw the child as someone incapable of taking care of himself. The latest evidence was his call for help. As an orphan, he was sympathetic to the plight of the child who had lost his mother so dramatically and tended to be more empathetic to him. However, if he knew what the child was really capable of, he would surely have argued otherwise. Faced with the young blonde's legitimate question, Jake shrugged before opting for a step-by-step plan. Hunting in the water was risky, so was hunting on the island, and they were almost naked. Their oracle rank was also far from being on top, and they had no measures at their disposal to hide their existence from other oracle devices. In this case, it was enough to ensure that none of the players had the courage to attack them or to arrange that only head-on confrontation was possible. In any case, the plan could be summarized under 4 key aspects: gearing up, getting stronger, earning points, and completing feats. The timing was right. There were quite a few feats that seemed to involve crafting. It was as if the creator of this sanctuary bubble knew from the beginning that each individual was different and foresaw a vast array of feats to be accomplished to cover everyone's specialties. Thus, no participant was truly disadvantaged, since there was always a way to earn points or rewards by using one's strengths. If someone was a mason, for example, there were plenty of construction challenges to grasp, and the ultimate reward was a question mark. Familiar with this kind of description, Jake knew that this was probably a reward comparable to the soul glyphs he had received. He didn't know what kind of titles and glyphs making a jungle hut could bestow, but based on his experience, it could only be worth it. No sooner said than done. Jake immediately took action, and accompanied by Sarah and Tim, they tracked down a group of rabid raptors under the influence of the red stone. The dinosaurs were almost 2 meters high and 4 meters long, even more massive than the Utahraptor mascots in Jurassic Park. Nevertheless, the trio had already faced T-Rexes, or worse, and they quickly wiped the floor with this pack. In their berserk state, these creatures' instinct to flee was non-existent, and exterminating them proved to be ridiculously simple now that they were all carrying weapons. Telekinesis did not work directly on these dangerous dinosaurs, but compressing the air or manipulating the earth around them was simple enough. Jake had never had the opportunity to practice these techniques, but now that his spirit body was strong enough and the green stone was replenishing his soul energy, it was the perfect opportunity to let go. With the phlegm of a gamer spamming relentlessly the same buttons to combo his foes to death without showing the slightest creativity, Jake was content to levitate some dirt, meld it, and then propel the new lava projectile with a wave of his hand at very high speed. The accuracy was average at first, but it quickly became as accurate as a rifle bullet and then exceeded it. At level 1, his telekinesis could only exert by default a force representing only 50% of that of his real body. But that was without counting on his spirit body LVL4 and his Myrmidian bloodline. By combining all of these factors, his telekinesis far exceeded the strength his muscles could exert. Coupled with the fact that he could apply this intangible force to a very small area, it was completely normal for him to be able to speed up projectiles at such a high speed. But these precise manipulations resulted in headaches, as the effort was close to the concentration required to achieve an ether core. Jake couldn't shoot like this indefinitely, but he was satisfied that he had obtained a new trump card. Moments later, the furious raptor pack of several dozen individuals had been completely eradicated, and the trio collected the ether before bringing the bodies back to the beach to be skinned. Their partnership was just beginning, and Jake still had a lot of techniques to try. Chapter 266 Base of Operations. Over the next few days, the trio strove to create a proper operating base, with Tim discreetly using his innate luck skill to help them find a Naquat-rich natural haven. Finding a safe and conveniently located place to operate had been a breeze. By daybreak, after a few hours of walking, their new base had been established. It was a clearing comparable to the ones Tim had discovered earlier, but it was larger, about the size of a basketball court, and located slightly higher up on a hillside. It was an ideal hideout, and was also concealed by huge trees whose foliage shielded them from aerial predators. Tim had been quite bitter to discover this place so late, because if he had found this refuge earlier, he would never have ended up in such a predicament. As for Jake and Sarah, they had not been impressed at all, even complaining about the lack of sunshine. Everything else was just the application of the survival principles they knew about to make the clothes and tools they needed. Jake already had this knowledge since the Oracle system had forced him to swallow all sorts of books on the subject, and for what he didn't know, he could simply make the proper wish by referring to his shadow guide. Jake thought he had a lot of ether with his almost 800,000 points, but he had soon realized that the rewards of the previous events were nothing more and nothing less than the salary financing their operating costs on the island. Each plant, flower, tree, and rock had its own qualities, and in hopes of fulfilling the exploration challenges of a herbalist, biologist, or geologist, they had been compelled to overuse the scan of their bracelet. Several tens of thousands of ether points had been squandered for these simple actions, and what they had discovered represented only a fraction of the island's wildlife and flora. Yet, it was not useless. The logbook function that Jake had almost forgotten had the merit of keeping every piece of information concerning him in a kind of huge virtual library, and this information could be accessed with a simple thought. With his current intelligence, though, it was seldom necessary for him to reread any data. Everything he learnt was kept fresh in his mind, and the mastery and understanding that came with learning was so crystal clear that he felt as if he had known these things all his life. Similarly, when he first undertook to craft leather for the first time, he had realized that he was perfectly familiar with the process, although he had only vaguely read an excerpt from a book on the subject. Tim and Sarah were not to be outdone, as their intelligence had also reached 100 ether points. Just by seeing Jake operate and listening to his explanations, it was extremely easy for them to imitate him and take their own initiatives. However, there was one task that was completely dependent on Jake, and that was the making of their working tools. Needles, vats, cutlery, pieces of armor, small pieces of furniture, bricks, or even an oven and forge. Jake's power was a miraculous shortcut to all these steps that could save them days in a few minutes. For example, without a needle, the leather and clothing they wanted to make would have been extremely difficult to sew into a usable form. Starting from scratch, they probably would have had to use bone, wood, or stone to achieve an uncertain result, but with Jake's powers it was that simple. His telekinesis was worth any mold, and he could forge any object, as long as it was not too small or the pressure and heat required was not too high. If the final result was fragile, he could always consolidate it with the gray ether. As for his magic of earth and heat, it saved them a lot of hassle by providing the raw material for most everyday objects. It was not only useful for making or forging objects, but also for detecting underground threats and analyzing the subsoil in depth. Once the routine had been set up, their base had taken shape in no time at all, and after a week the trio no longer looked like Cro-Magnons. The raptor corpses had provided them with the scale and feather-covered skins they needed, and after skinning them, removing all traces of residual flesh, the leather manufacturing had begun. Jake had made a vat with his earth control that he had filled with seawater and then boiled to collect enough salt. The hides had then been salted for a full day to ensure their preservation, since they had too much of them for immediate use. The next day, they had been soaked for a few hours to remove dirt and other impurities and then scraped properly on a specially made stone table. For this, Jake had to make suitable serrated knives, but the final result had been convincing given that this was his first time. The hides had then been rinsed and dried, and the scales from some of the hides had been scraped off in turn to give them a greater variety of choices. The tanning had been done directly by boiling the brains of the velociraptors and had required several days of rest, not to mention the final scraping where the smell of the decomposing residual brains had been a real test for their sense of smell. Sarah had even vomited twice as tough as she desired to be. As long as the process may have seemed, it actually required very little attention. Aside from the daily need to soften the hides, which Jake could do with a few telekinetic movements, they had been free to go about their business the rest of the time, and some steps had even been useful outside of the leather-making process. Tim, who had only managed to hydrate himself by sucking on the juice or blood of whatever fruits or animals on the island, had discovered with wonder that it was ridiculously simple to get drinking water from seawater. When Jake was boiling the seawater in his tank, he had simply placed a sloping vent leading to another tank, and the condensing steam had simply trickled down into the second tank. A single action had provided them with salt and drinking water, eliminating one of the major threats to their medium-term survival. By salting and smoking the meat, the problem of food had also been solved, and with his abilities, they had not made it difficult for Jake to build an underground cellar. The rest of the time, the group had worked hard to build a proper fortress, and although the end result was relatively modest, a 3-room stone house in the middle of the jungle could be considered an incredible accomplishment. Most of the credit went to Jake and his ether skills, which were particularly well suited to make him a builder, but the sanctuary bubble had considered this a common achievement. All had received a notification from their system informing them that the builder, Stone Age, Gold, feat had been completed, rewarding them with 100,000 ether points. The house may have been nice, but it was nothing more and nothing less than Jake melting and shaping the surrounding rock and earth. He'd made so many bricks that he'd stopped counting them, but he knew that this accomplishment posed no threat to a player yearning for his death. It was for this reason that they had set all kinds of traps all around their camp. It wasn't enough to neutralize an Oracle device user, but the sheer numbers of traps could easily cause a player to make a mistake if he was even the slightest bit careless. Even the trio who had set them down had almost fallen into them several times. But all these precautions would never be able to stand up to absolute might, and that's why they had also given a lot of emphasis to hunting and training. Making use of the mapping function of their bracelets, the trio had explored more than 100 kilometers around and never separated from each other by more than a few meters. Even to relieve themselves, Jake always had to be present nearby to stand guard and vice versa. This was to prevent the risk of being ambushed by a participant capable of evading the calculations of their oracle paths. Taking part in all this exploration, they had managed to map everything that could be mapped and had been able to use this knowledge to hunt freely. They had soon realized that the players were not the worst threat on the island. There were monster bosses reigning in all regions of the island and ocean, each jealously guarding their territory. The sea monster that had attacked Jake was one of them, while the Triceratops bull was another. Since then they had discovered a few others and had learned to avoid them at all costs. The trio had also discovered an entire village of the charcoal-colored humanoid creatures that Jake had faced in his second trial, and they had only managed to survive by retreating swiftly. Other than that, and with a few precautions, surviving on the island's outskirts hadn't been that difficult. As long as they did not venture to the high plateaus and mountains deep in the heart of the island and avoided these tyrannical and dominating bosses, hunting was not complicated. Jake and Sarah's ether stats had progressed well over the week, their confidence growing with each victory. Alas, Tim couldn't say the same. As his bloodline was devoid of the self-encoding skill, he could only bring himself to look at his useless ether stock in despair. Chapter 267 Intruders. Increasingly depressed, the child had to resolve to watch the two adults become stronger by the hour while his abilities had not changed one iota. Only his ether of luck could still be improved, but the number of ether points required to increase it by a single point was staggering and exponentially increasing. Before, to increase this ether stat by 1 point, he only needed 100 ether points, but to increase from 29 to 30 it had taken him almost 1,000. In principle, it was similar to using a higher grade encoding, except that the quality of his ether had not changed. The 100-point barrier had not yet been reached, but the amount of ether required for each additional point was increasing substantially. Luck was a mysterious field that did not obey conventional rules. Unlike other types of ether, they were unable to perceive the ether of luck, and this one had no virtual color to facilitate its observation. It was an abstract and impalpable notion, and he had no idea how this ether worked, nor where this ether was stored. Nevertheless, his luck was the only factor that Tim could influence, and fatally he had no choice but to stake all of his ether on it. His only wish was to remain alive until the day it would live up to his expectations. Ignorant of Tim's plight, on the 7th day of their collaboration, Jake and Sarah were on the contrary in a joyful mood. After an embarrassing week, they had finally been able to make themselves a decent leather armor and were coming back from their first expedition dressed with style. The trio had become accustomed to traveling barefoot during this ordeal, and regaining the comfort of footwear was a memorable experience. No more splinters, no more accidental cuts, and no more risk of being accidentally bitten or stung by an insect or reptile. Neither Sarah nor Jake was an expert costumer, and they had butchered a good part of their leather stock before they got the hang of it. If their intelligence and dexterity had been the same as when they were human a few months earlier, they would never have been able to sew these armors so quickly, and certainly not so elegantly. The end result was admirable, and after making the first one, weaving or sewing other garments became much easier. With their leather armors, belts, boots, knife gear, and animal skin backpacks, they looked like a group of rangers. Sarah had even made herself a bow and arrows which she was still learning to use. At that very moment, Jake was dragging the corpse of a woolly rhinoceros that had just decided to climb down from its mountain, while Tim and Sarah were carrying a huge wicker basket full of fruit. With their relaxed laughter and expressions, one would have thought they were a happy family out picking mushrooms, except that they were covered in blood from head to boots. As they chatted on their way home, the air they exhaled would form a distinct smoke, reflecting the fact that the temperature had dropped drastically over the past week. At first, they had decided to make clothes for the sake of decency and dignity, but they were now very happy with their decision. At the rate the temperatures were plummeting, they would probably turn negative in the next 3 or 4 days. The sun was also no longer visible, and for the past 2 days thick storm clouds had been gathering over them. Those who had not secured for themselves a shelter or a place to keep warm might soon face a real crisis. Over the course of the week, the trio had coldly watched the number of candidates gradually dwindle. Of the 7,000 or so participants present at Jake's arrival, there were now only 5,900 left. The points of the top 10 players had continued to accumulate over the first few days, as had their number of kills, but this trend had eventually leveled off. It seemed that the less talented participants had finally been eliminated, and those still in the running were no longer such easy prey. The other more likely possibility, however, was that the rapidly changing climate had alarmed these warmongering participants, and their priorities had changed. The trio also had no news of Will and the two sisters. Tim had repeatedly offered to go look for them, but the location of the nerd changed frequently, and the two sisters were too far away from them. These three, although separated, were in the center of the island, if not on the other side. A distance impossible to cover in a single day. Will's points were climbing incredibly fast, and he had even overtaken Jake, moving up to 47th place. Jake and Sarah wondered how the businessman had managed this feat, but remembering that he was their ally, they could not help but feel reassured. As for the two sisters, their position in the rankings had stagnated for the first half of the week before suddenly skyrocketing. The trio had no idea how they were able to pull off this feat as resourceful as Will was. The two noble women had never seemed to be very resourceful. The fact that they had reached the third trial had already been a huge surprise for Jake. Late in the afternoon, they saw the hillside where their base was hidden and picked up the pace. Meanwhile, the clouds had turned gray-black and the rumble of thunder had begun to resound. The branches and leaves of the century-old trees around them had begun to bend and hum under the force of the wind, signaling the unprecedented power of the approaching storm. "I am not feeling good about this storm," Tim said apprehensively, staring at the threatening black clouds. Coming from someone with a keen sense of danger and uncommon good fortune, it was a comment to be taken seriously. Sarah frowned as she thought of something, but she shook her head to chase away the wild idea. The possibility that this storm was artificially created by the organizers of the trial was inherently terrifying. Moments later, they finally arrived at the foot of the hillside where their base was hidden and began to check if the traps were still in place. After a quick glance, their relaxed muscles suddenly stiffened into a state of heightened alertness. Drawing out their respective machete, gladius, and axe, the trio glanced at each other with a grim expression. Their ether intelligence being high enough to employ telepathy, Jake grunted mentally with some tension in his voice. "Someone is there." Nodding her head, Sarah knelt down a few meters away to inspect the ground and confirmed telepathically with a serious expression. "There are two of them." "At least two," Jake interjected. "If their allies fly or can move underground like me, they could be a lot more." Jake did not mention that the probability was still low, but since he could do it, they would be wrong to ignore this possibility. Still, if these newcomers thought they could sleep for free in their humble abode without paying rent, they would bitterly regret it. The traps that the trio had set up outside were just a facade. The real death zone was the house itself. The house was designed as a three-dimensional puzzle, each brick having a different shape, forming a kind of complex lock holding the structure in place. To a stranger unfamiliar with the place, the stone building seemed to be built in one piece. But the truth was that there were many projectiles inserted in the interstices, even in the bricks themselves. This architectural marvel was only possible thanks to Jake's high intelligence and his fine earth manipulation skills that had improved considerably over the past week. With one thought, Jake could at any time encompass the house with his spirit body and take control of all these projectiles to turn intruders into a ball of needles. Better yet, if the intruder was able to spot these projectiles and take control of them, he could simply collapse the building. A complex combination of movements held the structure in place that Jake had memorized in advance. By creating this sequence, he had made sure that even an individual smarter than himself would not have a chance to solve the puzzle quickly. In the worst-case scenario, a psychist scanning the walls and ceiling with his extrasensory perception would have simply thought that there was a harmless hole in the middle of the layer of stone constituting the ceiling. Even if he discovered that the neighboring bricks were in fact movable, finding this solution would literally be suicide. It would be like removing the keystone holding the entire building in place. Sarah and Tim were well aware of this, as they had discussed it at length with each other before they devised the process. Fearlessly, the trio silently levitated to the clearing, allowing themselves to be lifted by Jake's telekinesis, and when they landed in the clearing, anxious voices echoed from inside the house. Chapter 268 Siblings. "You see? I told you to trust the Oracle. A little more, and we were going to freeze to death." A weary baritone voice pierced the silence of the clearing. "Idiot." A second female voice, so graceful that it sounded like the one in the TV commercials, retorted curtly. Except that Jake and the others couldn't understand a word of their exchange, which sounded both relieved and worried. Chinese? The trio thought the same thing. And why those two voices sounded so familiar, Jake wondered with a troubled wrinkle in the center of his forehead. Meanwhile, the man and woman inside their home base were still arguing, totally unaware of their presence, or maybe not. Why so foolish? The man who seemed immature objected in frustration. "Thanks to me, we have a roof over our heads, and the shadow guide guided me to this place when I wished to find a safe shelter." Slap. "Idiot." A safe shelter for you. My shadow guide advises me to get out of here right now. The woman exploded into a sudden, irrepressible fury. You hit me. The man's voice was in a state of shock, as if his vision of reality had just shattered. And why not? You deserved it. The owners of the house are already here. She was not wrong. Even though he didn't understand Chinese, Jake didn't need to be a genius to pick up on the changes in tone and emotion. Just a few feet below them, Jake could practically picture their movements from the contact of their feet on the ground. He had refrained from deploying his spirit body, but it seemed that the Chinese-speaking woman had been vigilant from the start. Not knowing how to hide his own etheric signature, he had known right away that his ambush had failed. Nonetheless, he still chose to remain motionless and mute to take control of the building's traps. The woman had perceived a foreign spirit body enveloping them, and it took her only a moment to realize that the entire house was under enemy control. At first, Jake was more curious than hostile, but when his spirit body and then his bracelet scanned both individuals, a resounding HMMPF escaped from his mouth, making the floor of the stone house vibrate. The woman had scanned him as well, and when she had read the popping up report in front of her eyes, her face had turned pale with terror. Shit, it's Jake. She yelled as she jumped up in the air with a backflip. Jake! The man, still confused from the slap he had just received, repeated the name foolishly without really catching the young woman's hysterical reaction. Boom. The stone floor exploded without warning, the tile floor of the building abruptly collapsing under their feet. Not at all prepared for this, the Chinese man, already disoriented, lost his balance and fell into the pit created. For a fraction of a second, the exploded floor seemed to come alive and began to swirl around his engulfed body to form a solid floor. After this unpredictable attack, only the man's head was still sticking out of the ground, his movements having been completely sealed. At the same time, another figure had risen from the ground at the same time, its golden and silver irises harboring intense viciousness. Recognizing these eyes, the young woman, who had landed on the roof like a spider by sticking her fingers into the interstices between the bricks, felt a hint of hatred, mixed with an overwhelming despair. It would seem that your lesson from the first ordeal was not enough for you. Jake snorted with an icy glare. Now you even want to steal the base that I built with my own hands? There's a misunderstanding. We just wanted a shelter to spend the night, I swear. The beautiful Chinese woman tried to justify herself as best she could while sweating profusely. Her appearance had changed significantly since the first ordeal. Since they had all been altered into Thrasgenian in the previous ordeal, none of them had displayed their true looks back then. They all had white hair, thick bones, and significantly higher musculature than the average human. Their intelligence had been markedly reduced, and their primitive instincts greatly magnified. The Lu Yin in front of him also lacked the long, smooth black hair he expected from a traditional Chinese woman. Like Sarah, her irises were golden, her skin rather tanned, and her hair of a black gold, betraying that she too had absorbed the Myrmidian bloodline. However, the spark of spirituality in her eyes was very close to his own, and Jake could recognize the Eltarian bloodline as well. Jake! The head protruding from the ground said again with unfeigned excitement. His black gold hair and golden eyes attested that he too had assimilated the Myrmidian bloodline. You see, I told you we were safe. Shut up. Jake and Lu Yin yelled at the same time without breaking eye contact with each other. At that moment, recognizing Jake's voice inside, Sarah and Tim stormed inside by kicking down the door. Gladius and axe up, the two individuals were ready for battle. Seeing the state of the door, Jake facepalmed. Fuck, they each have a key. The real question was rather how Lu Feng and Lu Yin had entered without breaking the lock. But remembering that the young woman had unlocked her 7th stat even before the first ordeal, it wasn't really shocking. Faced with two new enemies armed to the teeth, Lu Yan's anxiety had soared yet again, if that was possible, having fought alongside Sarah in the Colosseum. Although their appearance was very different back then, she was still able to identify this fierce female warrior at first glance. Knowing that if Jake wanted her dead, she would have no chance of getting out of that house alive, she threw her wooden spike on the floor and immediately got down on her knees to implore him. As cold and selfish as she was, she knew her priorities. Please, Let me go and I promise not to cross your path for the duration of the ordeal. Sister, what are you doing? Jake, let me go. Lu Yifeng cried out, struggling with all his strength in vain. His face was red and congested under the effort, but he was unable to dislodge himself from the ground. It was not that the ground was too hard. With their strength, it was not impossible to slowly break the rock if they devoted themselves to it completely. But it was without counting out Jake's earth control. Every time the young man managed to move up an inch, the ground would soften like quicksand, bringing him back to his starting position. I can let you escape. Jake nodded as he looked at the buried man. But it's impossible for me to trust your sister again. If you don't get it, she's a manipulative psychopath. What's he talking about, sister? He's saying that you're a complete moron. Lu Yin spat indignantly, giving up the idea of begging him. She would rather die with her chin up. Turning to Jake again, not forgetting to pick up her crude spear, she proudly declared, "If I had to do it all over again, I would do it the same way. My life is more valuable than those of strangers except for my brothers. I've played these kinds of games long enough to know that no one can be trusted. Everybody betrays you at some point, so you might as well take the initiative." In response, Jake sneered at the young woman's defiant look. "Sure, you can betray whoever you want if that's what you think, but you have to be able to pay the price. For a few ether points, you killed innocent people and conspired against other players." Innocent of what? Players can resurrect, so I clearly have no remorse on my conscience. It's nothing more than a game. A deadly game, but a game. As for these NPCs, why should I care? Jake choked her with his telekinesis before she started spouting more nonsense. She tried with all her might to repel Jake's invisible grip with her own powers, but her spirit body and stats weren't strong enough. "Jake, let go of her. I promise we'll leave you alone. This is a misunderstanding." Lu Yifeng screamed in panic with red eyes about to burst into tears. He had started struggling again like a madman, but for naught. Sarah and Tim were also shocked to see this side of Jake, but knowing his abilities, they wisely chose not to intervene. Ignoring Lu Yifeng's buzzing, Jake coldly dropped every word between his teeth. "They are not NPCs. You are just a murderer." After that, the telekinetic pressure around her throat disappeared, and the young woman dropped to the floor, coughing repeatedly with a cyanotic face. She seemed to be in a state of shock. Before she could say another word, with a wave of his hand, and under the stunned gaze of Sarah and Tim, Jake grabbed the siblings with his spirit body and expelled them outside before closing the door with a big bang. Chapter 269, Night in the Storm. Sarah and Tim stared at him for a long minute in amazement without daring to break the silence. But the young blonde just couldn't help but ask the question that was bugging her. Are you really going to leave them out in the cold like that?" She asked hesitantly. "Why not?" Jake replied without the slightest qualms. "But if they don't find a safe place quickly, it might be dangerous for them if the storm turns out to be as fierce as the current weather suggests. Their evolvers with their ether stats maxed out or close to it. As long as they don't spend the night naked in a blizzard, I doubt a storm could kill them." Jake brushed off her argument with an irritated wave of his hand. "What could they have done to make you hate them so much?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide open in amazement. She was aware of his social ineptitude and his taciturn nature, but she didn't know he could hold such a grudge. Jake had no intention of justifying himself, so he simply retorted, "They deserve what happens to them," before sitting cross-legged on his bed of stone and furs and closing his eyes to start meditating. Whenever he had some free time, he would use it to study the green soul stone or perfect his ether manipulation in order to create an ether core. He might not always have a soul stone like this to rejuvenate his mind after overuse of ether skills, and it was only really effective at night when it released its precious accumulated soul energy. Furthermore, even if this hadn't happened yet, he couldn't ignore the possibility of running into an opponent with a spirit body strong enough to monopolize control of the ether in an entire area. If that happened, all of his ether skills would become unusable at close range. This was an easy problem to solve when the spirit body's range was short, but it would become a fatal handicap when the average player became able to extend his extrasensory perception over several kilometers. It wasn't as if he could keep his distance at all times from his enemies in such a situation. Sarah stood there like a pole for a few more seconds, biting her lip in frustration, but faced with his indifference, she decided not to bother anymore. Although she was arrogant and selfish, she still had some empathy in her heart, especially when it required very little effort on her part. Letting these two players spend the night from her perspective was only beneficial, but if Jake didn't want them, it wasn't as if she thought she could convince him. As for Tim, he didn't give a damn. He didn't know who they were, and Jake was the law. If he didn't want them, it just meant there was something wrong with these two people. His reasoning was really that straightforward. For a few minutes, they heard Lu Yin and Lu Yifeng talking in Chinese with a worried tone on the other side of the door, and then the thud of their footsteps eventually faded away along with long sighs. Their lives then returned to normal, and each went about his or her business. Jake was already sweating profusely, and his frowning eyebrows betrayed intense concentration. Tim and Sarah had already asked him what he was doing a few days earlier to be in this state. But even after he had told them about all the benefits of an ether core, they hadn't deemed it necessary to create one. In fact, none of them had any ether skills that required extracorporeal ether control. Tim's ether skills could be considered to require long-distance ether control, but unfortunately, there was no observable ether movement to indicate that Tim could consciously influence the process. Even if he could create an ether core, he wouldn't know what to do with it, and it was unlikely to make any difference. This was naive, and if Jake had known of his abilities, he would certainly have done more to encourage him to create his own ether core. No matter how miraculous luck or perception of danger might seem, the energy driving these skills had to come from somewhere. Thus, choosing not to bother him, Sarah began to skin the woolly rhino they had left outside, and Tim proceeded to practice the axe katas he had learnt in the previous ordeal, felling a few more trees in the process. Once his two comrades were outside, Jake opened his eyes and breathed a sigh of relief. He knew that Lu Yifeng at the very least did not deserve to be thrown out like that, but he really could not trust Lu Yin. When he was weaker and naive, he didn't pay particular attention to his instincts. But now that his intelligence and perception had taken a new step, he was much more aware of the threats posed by the people orbiting around him. Even at this stage, he still didn't trust anyone, not even the kid. As smart as Tim thought he was, it was easy for Jake and Sarah to realize that he was hiding something. No matter how mature the child might seem for his age because of his experiences and his intelligence ether, he was still a child. Expecting him to be a flawless actor was inconceivable. After all, even Jake could barely control his facial muscles with his dexterity, but that didn't mean he could readily express even the most subtle emotions. More importantly, it was even harder to lie all the time without giving himself away. Until proven otherwise, Tim did not have a multitasking ability. In their group, only Sarah and perhaps Will could be considered good speakers, and with their new stats, it had become almost impossible to probe them. As far as Jake knew, the young woman's giggles, smirks, and grimaces could all be intentional and not spontaneous. That was why Jake was suspicious of Lu Yin. Even though she was already gifted long before the first ordeal, there was still something fake about her behavior, as if she was not feeling emotions normally. The increase in her intelligence had not helped and made her even more cold and inexpressive. Jake really wondered how Lu Yifeng could be oblivious to his sister's true nature. Unless he was fooling himself by idealizing his little sister, it was impossible. As such, no matter how naive and candid Lu Yifeng may appear, it was wiser to assume that he condoned his sister's eccentricities and had turned a blind eye to her potential crimes. Well, maybe he was just paranoid, and this young woman was simply even more antisocial than he was. Exhaling deeply to clear his head, he extended his senses to the outside of the building to check if everything was going well outside, and seeing that the siblings were really gone, he immersed himself once more in his ether core creation training. The hours flew by, and the sun finally gave way to the stars. Sarah and Tim had returned home shortly afterwards with the storm approaching and were practicing in their room. The wind had increased in intensity, and the murmur of the wind blowing against the stone was so loud that they were likely to stay awake all night. Soon the rumble of thunder resounded, startling them all. A few seconds later, the repeated impact of the hailstones on the stone house roof forced them to halt their activities for good. Contemplative, Jake opened the doors separating them from the storm outside, and what he witnessed shocked him deeply. Ice hailstones as big as pine cones, and a biting cold almost burning his skin. Thinking back to what he had said earlier, He was no longer so confident about the siblings' chances of survival. Forget it. If they returned, he was willing to open the door as long as he could keep his eyes on them, but this was unlikely. The stone walls couldn't keep the cold out indefinitely, and as incredible as it was, the temperature was still dropping. Jake lit a fire in the fireplace by placing his incandescent hand against a log, and quickly the heat spread throughout the residence, almost making them forget about the storm outside. The group then roasted one of the woolly rhino's legs and feasted, while sharing a few anecdotes about their past lives. As they were about to go to bed, or in Jake's case meditate again, a heart-rending scream echoed outside, followed by an agonizing cry that sounded very much like Louis Feng's. Unsurprisingly, someone started banging on their door a few minutes later, accompanied by a distraught woman's voice. "Please, is there anyone there? I have a wounded with me. Please open the door. He won't survive long like this." It's not Lu Yin, Jake realized as he jumped out of bed with his machete. And yet he actually knew that voice. Tim next to him seemed to have recognized it too, and his childish face was quivering with excitement. Chapter 270 New Guest? Even before Jake gave them the go-ahead to open, Tim had already rushed to the door and removed the lock and the heavy wooden latch, preventing the door from opening from the outside. When the door opened abruptly, the girl pounding on the door was violently flung backwards and fell painfully on her buttocks with an ouch. Dumbfounded, Tim was about to apologize and help her get up when a fist-sized hailstone rained down on his skull like a meteorite, almost knocking him unconscious. In the same second, a second hailstone struck the teenage girl's shoulder on the ground, while another smashed the nose of a still dizzy Tim. A high-pitched "Airg" escaped from the boy's vocal cords, while the girl just gritted her teeth and gave him a hateful glare. Feeling that the situation could escalate if they didn't intervene quickly, Jake wrapped the two teenagers and the unconscious wounded man on a makeshift stretcher to protect them from the ice projectiles raining down from the sky, and invited them inside. "Thank you, Jake." Lily's face finally relaxed when she recognized her cousin and hurriedly carried her father to the fireplace. After watching her mother being devoured by digesters, Lily and her father had survived together since then on their own, and going through the first two trials separately had been a terrible experience for them. In comparison, the physical suffering resulting from these trials was not in the forefront. As soon as they had arrived on the real island, they had rushed towards each other like the two pink-haired sisters or the Chinese siblings had done. In this respect, Jake, Sarah, and Will were very different, more comfortable operating independently. Keeping a watchful eye, Jake inspected his cousin from head to toe, then his uncle passed out in the stretcher. Lily looked like a younger Anya with chestnut brown hair and green eyes, and had just entered puberty, while Daniel was a common-looking brown man, but known to have a good heart. Both suffered from frostbite, which was relatively unbelievable considering their stats and the temperatures earlier, but the brief moment he had opened the door had confirmed to him for the second time in a row that he had greatly underestimated the storm. The ice hailstones were not even melting on contact with the ground, piling up like a mountain of snowballs, and the wind had reached a rare intensity, uprooting the frailest exposed trees. The air was so cold that it was turning scorching, but that was not the thing to blame for their condition. Although they had been hit repeatedly by hail, to the point of accumulating numerous bruises and bumps, the deep lacerations on their bodies revealed that they had been facing a very different and much more direct threat. These lacerations resembled whip marks, but from a high-voltage whip capable of tearing the flesh several centimeters deep. Jake didn't need to use his spirit body or his bracelet scan to spot them, since his uncle and young cousin were almost completely unclothed. Judging by the state of the rags of plant fibers covering their private parts, neither of them had found the time to make proper clothing, and their slimmed-down condition attested that, like Tim, they had always been on the run, trying to survive the ubiquitous predators. Lily was coping with minor injuries, although she would probably keep a nasty scar on her back, but alas, Jake could not say the same for his uncle Daniel. At first glance, he had withstood most of the enemy's attacks to protect his daughter, and in addition to being lacerated all over, he had also lost a lot of blood. His level of weight loss was also more pronounced than that of the girl, indicating that he had let his daughter eat her fill at his expense. Worried that the enemy on their heels had followed them, Sarah glanced out through the peephole, but apart from the noise of hailstones falling relentlessly, The clearing and the trees around it were completely silent and static. Relieved, she joined them around the fire and added a log, but she refused to part with her gladius, a clear sign that she did not feel safe. Tim, for his part, had suddenly grown mute from shyness, the shame of his previous action coming back to him. Most importantly, he had just broken his nose, and it was bloodily painful. Maintaining a strong and insensitive demeanor was already demanding his full attention. Meanwhile, Jake had scanned his two relatives with his bracelet and was surprised to learn that their stats were not so good. Like Tim, they had reached the 100-point limit, but it was clear from Lily's movements that her body and mind was not used to these changes. Based on his first impressions, both father and daughter had maxed out their ether stats recently, taking advantage of the rewards of the first and second trials. The results of their first ordeal must therefore have been rather poor, along those of Will and Tim. The only reason why these two were not in the same situation was because they had received their share in the sale of the rank 7 digester corpse. Of course, neither of them had inherited any special bloodline. They were just as human as they could be. Aware that Daniel's life prognosis was on the line, Jake knelt down beside him and examined the large gash on his chest before calling for a hand. Sarah and Tim, come help me. You can come too. Lily, it will be helpful to you. Sarah, who was just starting to warm up, walked beside him without flinching and understanding what Jake was waiting for, closed the edges of the largest chest wound to make it easier for him. Already a sewing expert, he sutured the wounds using a hair he stole from Sarah as suturing thread. These hair was already strong enough to withstand this kind of strain. In a few twists of thread, Daniel's wounds were sewn back together, and all that was left to do was to let his ether of vitality do the rest. As Tim proudly prepared to stitch the wound in Lily's back to show the extent of his expertise and make up for his past mistake, someone knocked on the door again. Bam! 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 The person knocking at their door was knocking like a madman, as if they were sorely in need of attention. The two Asian Myrmidians from earlier? Sarah asked with renewed worry and puzzlement. The young woman's hands had turned white as she squeezed the handle of her weapon. I'm not sure, Jake said hesitantly. He wanted to believe it, but after that first cry of agony, he hadn't heard them anymore. It had been several hours since they had thrown them out. Besides, instead of knocking at their door, announcing their presence out loud would have made more sense. With silent gestures, he motioned for everyone to pick up a weapon except for Daniel, who was still in a coma. Seeing that Lily had no weapon or had lost it earlier during their escape, Tim handed her his second axe, obviously intending to convert her to this noble art. Once everyone was ready, Jake floated with Sarah on either side of the door and then opened it abruptly, with the same timing as the knocking. The fist knocking tirelessly on the door hit the void, and the owner swung forward, carried away by his momentum. Reflexively, the owner managed to recover in a fraction of a second, but it was too late. Jake and Sarah were already holding him at gunpoint with their blades, the edge of the first against his throat, while the edge of the second covered his neck. Raising his hands in the air, the monster uttered a rocky laugh, visibly enchanted. Cough, cough, it's me. Don't you recognize me? Jake swept the humanoid creature from head to toe and saw only an abomination halfway between man and bear. His long brown hair was covered with melted ice and reeked of wet dog. Arching a disdainful eyebrow, he coldly replied, Should I? Of course you should. I'm your cousin Kevin. Jake and Lily's eyes widened in disbelief over this revelation. Was his stone house the place decided to hold a fucking family party? Why was he the only one who didn't know about it? Lily, is this the monster that attacked you? Jake checked in indifferently. He had already confirmed with a scan that it was his hated cousin, but he was more than happy to play the fool. No. What the hell, dude? Just look. The werebear or werefat-wolf protested vigorously, wounded in the ego that they might doubt his identity. His bestial appearance suddenly began to retract, the fur covering him disappearing under his skin. A few bones creaking were heard, interspersed with muffled grunts of pain. Then seconds later, a very tall, muscular man stood in front of them with a smile revealing a row of sparkling white teeth. Hello there. But even before the people in the house got time to digest the situation, someone knocked on the door again. Is it the only fucking stone house on the island? Jake sighed in exasperation. Chapter 271 So weak. Once again, the newcomer knocking at their door had chosen not to announce itself verbally, simply ramming itself hard against the door without uttering a sound. At least the others weren't trying to destroy my door. Jake inwardly fumed as he watched the wooden door reinforced with cooled lava crack and warp with each blow. If it broke completely, it wouldn't make any difference whether they were inside or outside the house. The freezing wind would seep through the walls, quenching the chimney fire, heating the room, and freezing them to the bone in a matter of minutes. Intolerable. Trembling with fury, Jake didn't even bother to ambush the person or thing on the other side of the door and engulfed it without warning with his spirit body before choking it with his telekinetic grip. It was the second time he resorted to this method in one day. Darth Vader truly had to watch out. Next, he kicked open the door, and the individual suffocating on the other side was almost knocked out by the blow. With the intruder neutralized, Jake was finally able to inspect this newcomer who had no sense of decorum. Kevin, you wouldn't have made a kid out of one of the bears on the island, right? He asked with a contemplative expression, mixed with disbelief and fake admiration. Hearing his cousin openly accusing him of zoophilia, the bear man who had reverted to human form began to twitch with rage, his veins and arteries congesting over his face, causing his blood pressure to rise dangerously. Of course not. Who do you think I am? Say something like that again, and I assure you that making a child with a bear will be the least of your worries. Is this a threat? Jake arched an intrigued eyebrow. At the same time, his spirit body engulfed the stone house with a special focus on his beloved cousin, and the muscular man felt an unbearable pressure seeping into his body. He felt the control of his limbs slipping away from him, and an intangible force was pressing his body to the ground, preventing him from moving and breathing properly. Tightening his muscles to the point of becoming tomato red, the long brown hairs that had covered his body a moment earlier resurfaced, and his appearance switched back to its bestial form, gaining almost 50 centimeters in height in the process. With this anatomical transformation, the werbear managed to raise his head high, the bestial aura pulsing out of his body, allowing him to push Jake's spirit away with great difficulty. Oomph. So what? You think I'm afraid of you? Hell no. I'll take you anytime you want. Upon realizing that his cousin was not in the least repentant, Jake's complexion darkened. Then tell me, why is there a fucking Ewok in front of my door? Jake exploded in a fit of rage as he dropped the creature into the lobby for all to see. Discovering the humanoid creature the size of a 4-year-old child that actually looked like a teddy bear crossed with a koala, the mouths of everyone present cracked open into a big O, Kevin included. Jake had already confirmed with his scan that it was a player, but the creature looked completely dumb. Apart from the fact that it had a solid skull, he couldn't imagine how such an alien could have survived until now. The poor thing was shivering non-stop in an advanced state of hypothermia. I've never seen it before in my life. Kevin spat as he made his long claws squeak against each other. I'll take his life right now to prove it to you. With a determined step, the bear man stepped forward with a murderous expression on his face towards the little fluffy creature still catching his breath. Stop. Lily had already stood between her cousin and the creature with a horrified look on her face. Then she turned to the terrified and sobbing little koala bear and took him in her arms, patting his back and whispering, "It's okay. Calm down. Mommy will take care of you." Jake. Kevin. The others. Fuck, that was so cringy. Jake was about to lecture his youngest cousin to remind her not to trust strangers when someone knocked on the door again. Jake opens the door. "I'm going to kill you." Recognizing the voice, Jake completely forgot about the Ewok, Lily, Kevin, and the sermon he had prepared. As he was about to comply with the intruder's wishes, he had barely lifted the latch when the door exploded, slamming him against the opposite wall with the door in tatters. Standing up instantly as if he had felt nothing, Jake spat out a bloody splinter of wood with a furious, livid face. Within minutes, his mood had fluctuated between extremes repeatedly. His lava veins exuded a distinct warmth and his irises had filled with a deep golden and silver glow, seemingly harboring a galaxy within them. Once Jake was in this peak fighting state, he was not to be pissed off at all. Sweeping around the room in search of the culprit, he was about to exterminate Liu Yin when he noticed something was wrong. The Liu Yin in question was passed out next to him, covered in blood, and having obviously been smashed with him along with the door. Not far away, her brother Louis Feng, or at least what was left of him, lay dead, his features frozen into a benevolent smile. Fucking creepy. Especially since his head was all he had left, and after hitting the wall and rolling on the floor it was so dented that it was beyond recognition. Not even his mother would have been able to identify him. As the icy wind blew into the house, Jake felt a shiver run through him and realized to his horror that it wasn't the cold. Because the humanoid creature standing in front of their door was a blood-curdling alien he had seen before. It was a humanoid creature more than 2 meters tall, massively muscular with a membranous obsidian skin. It seemed to be equipped with a helmet shaped like the head of some indescribable monster. Underneath, a huge gaping mouth with thousands of teeth like a lamprey. No eyes but thousands of luminescent dendrites as hair from a few centimeters to several meters long, smelling and perceiving the environment around it, as if each one had a life of its own. An armor in an unknown metal protected the vital parts of the creature, including a breastplate, arm guards, leggings, and shoulder pads. The creature held a sort of black blade that seemed to grow from an accessory above its wrist. In other words, it was the same creature that had hunted Yerode and Lamine the night before his first ordeal. An alien capable of firing high-energy plasma shots through the dendrites on its head, with each hair having the strength of a steel rope and its own autonomy. Even now, he was not at all confident of winning a fight to the death against such an opponent. Kevin and Sarah's ugly faces showed that they too shared the same feeling. The alien emitted no deadly aura. Its spirit body was retracted into its own body, and yet the psychological pressure they felt was overwhelming. Only Lily, Tim, and the little bear seemed oblivious to the sparks flying between the two parties. Jake routinely scanned the newcomer with his bracelet, and a ridiculously short report popped up in his mind. Species, Nosk. It was the briefest description he'd ever seen, and there was only one possibility: Oracle rank suppression or an Oracle cloaking skill. Either way, it was very bad news. Nevertheless, Jake wasn't afraid. If he had met this opponent in the wild, he would certainly have fled without hesitation to avoid taking undue risks, but attacking him in his own home was suicide. And yet, the Nosk had still entered his living room without showing the slightest hesitation, as if the needles hidden in the wall and the ceiling did not exist. Does he have a plan? It doesn't matter, I don't have much choice. Still silent, the humanoid alien took one step forward, and then another, his dendrites spreading out like a peacock courting, or rather like a multitude of snakes preparing to attack. With each step forward that the creature took, Kevin and Sarah took a step backwards, the former growling and showing his fangs in a vain attempt to scare the enemy. Only Jake had continued to stare at the creature with a haughty look on his face, and it was perfectly intentional. I want you to go a little further. After a time that seemed interminable, the alien stopped in the center of the room, equidistant from each of them, and emitted a long whistle, as if inviting them all to attack him at the same time. All at the same time? All right, I'll give you all my needles. Jake chuckled. With this thought, the needles inserted between each brick left their base, and the ground under the alien's feet disassembled, forming the same chasm that had trapped Lu Yifeng earlier. Surprised, the alien lost his balance and fell helplessly into the hole. The ground regained its solid shape around the creature's body, enclosing it solidly in the rock, most of its dendrites included. Everyone in the room staggered in astonishment at the sight, Jake included. So easy? Why is he so weak? Chapter 272: The Incredible Nosk. Kevin, who was growling in a defensive posture a few seconds earlier, was now wearing a very funny expression, while Sarah, the only other female fighter in the mix, was as shocked as Jake. Like him, she had encountered a Nosk before, and she remembered very well the feeling of helplessness one can feel when faced with such creatures. The exchange of pointers between a Nosk and a multicolored alien bubble was fresh in their memory and was enough to make them despair back then. As flabbergasted as Jake was by this absurd turn of events, he hadn't let his guard down. Once the surprise passed, he mercilessly bombed the Nosk stuck in the ground with the needles under his control. Their thickness of less than a millimeter and the speed at which he blasted them at the alien made them virtually indistinguishable, and a shrill whistle of air pierced their eardrums when he took action. A current of air momentarily thwarted the icy wind coming from the outside, testifying to their extreme speed and synchronicity. Clang, clang, clang. Yet Jake's face became more and more solemnized as the relentless bombing continued. The Nosk hadn't moved, only its head protruding from the welded ground, but its helmet and the dendrites covering its skull were dealing with these attacks in the same way as a tank crashed by a bicycle. Not content to do no damage, the needles broke one by one, leaving their maker frustrated and helpless. My precious, Jake lamented inwardly as he saw all of his work shattered in seconds. If he had known that all these preparations would be useless, he wouldn't have wasted all this time. I can't let it go on like this. Just as he was about to execute his next contingency plan, a vibration under his feet followed by a crack momentarily stopped him in his tracks. The Nosk had finally decided to react. The muscles of the buried alien suddenly contracted, causing thick worm-like veins to appear on the surface of his skin. Simultaneously, the Nosk drew a deep breath, its lung capacity and diaphragm proving to be in a different dimension compared to those of humans. Its chest swelled to the point of doubling in size, as did its muscles in a brief instant, and the solidified rock around it instantly cracked under the pressure. The alien then shook its body 2 or 3 times with sharp movements, reminiscent of spasms, splitting and cracking the ground even more. Next, the alien exhaled suddenly, and the difference in volume suddenly created a space that allowed the alien to free itself. With a few more shakes, the enemy was completely freed from its rock prison. While witnessing this demonstration of physical power, Kevin, who was extremely confident in the strength of his beastly form, lost much of his luster. Compared to Jake and his other cousins, this bestial form was his ultimate fighting form, and the only ability he had relied on to get this far in the ordeal was his physique. But in the face of this creature, he was no longer so confident of winning. As for Sarah, she knew from the beginning that it would be a desperate battle, so her mental state had not been affected more than that. On the contrary, it gave her the conviction she lacked to face this new challenge. Her Myrmidian instincts had been triggered. As the Nosk silently gazed at them arrogantly, its expression impossible to distinguish under its helmet, Sarah's gladius struck without warning from behind, making a decisive attempt to decapitate the monster. Splash! Electric blue blood began to flow abundantly on the shattered ground. The alien had uttered no sound, and its head was still on its shoulders, but the way it turned its neck towards the young woman was a clear indication that it was not expecting this. One of its precious dendrites had been severed. Each of them was supposed to be stronger than steel, and this was even more true after increasing its ether stats. Intrigued, the motionless Nosk stared at the young woman from head to toe before lingering on the weapon in her hand. Sarah sensed a presence scanning her, and she had the unspeakable feeling that she had been raped by the eyes of the enemy, as if her own soul had been exposed. She understood right away that the alien was interested in her weapon and understood what had just happened. But while she was still mulling over how to approach her next attack, the alien emitted a shrill, jerky sound as its chest repeatedly lifted and deflated. He's laughing, Jake realized as he squinted warily. As if to confirm his conclusion, the Nosk averted its gaze from the young woman and shook its hand strangely with a gentle, smooth gesture. Schlink. A black jade-like blade grew magically from a device attached above its gauntlet. In a fraction of a second, the blade lengthened to about a meter long. Then with another bizarre wrist gesture, the blade fell off into its hand. The alien then grabbed a short, thick stick from its belt about a foot long and inserted the blade inside with a click. Only then did Jake realize that it was the hilt of a sword. Taunting them with extreme nonchalance, the Nosk made a few slow swings with its sword before performing a slash of great violence that swiftly broke through the sound barrier. The floor of the house, already in poor condition, was embellished with a new trench after this blow. Satisfied, the alien began the attack, leaving an afterimage behind. It was not related to its extreme speed, but a true hologram. By some unknown means, the warrior was generating holographic clones behind him to add to the confusion. Kevin blocked, intending to ward off a real strike, but the clone was a fake. Jake knew at first glance from his Murtharian pupil skill that it was a fake too and jumped straight to the Nosk in order to intercept the deadly blow intended for Sarah. Aware of the threat posed by this formidable opponent, Jake gathered all his ether of strength, agility, and constitution in his main arm to amplify his strike, and even assisted the movement with the full power of his telekinesis. At the same time, his spirit body pulsed, and the ground beneath the alien's feet rose abruptly to form a podium covered with spikes almost a meter high. Sensing the danger posed by Jake, the alien interrupted halfway down its downward sword stroke that could have cut the young woman in half if it had hit its target, and retaliated with a lateral slash that hit Jake's machete, resulting in a deafening bang. Jake, who had pounced on the Nosk, lost all momentum and remained momentarily suspended in the air, while the ground beneath the alien exploded on impact as its feet sank several inches into the ground, and several rock spears pierced his skin, boots, and legs. The Nosk staggered slightly under the blow with a startled expression under its helmet. The blade of its sword and the breastplate covering its torso split in two. Sarah, who had not relaxed her attention, struck with all her might from behind the crook of its knees and missed her target, cutting another dendrite instead. The alien was injured, though, and even Kevin knew this was an opportunity not to be missed. Only God knew if this creature had hidden regenerative abilities. In the split second that followed, Kevin, who didn't want to look like a useless coward, rammed into the Nosk, who had lost his weapon, and began to scratch him savagely with claws and hammer punches. However, before he could even place more than 3 blows, a backhand hook of phenomenal power that broke half of his teeth and rattled his brain sent him flying in the air from where he had come from. The werbear crashed miserably in the shape of a star against another stone wall, breaking a few more bones. The whole action had lasted less than a second. Nevertheless, this brief respite had allowed Jake and Sarah to corner the Nosk a little more. The rock had tightened around the alien's ankles during this fleeting lapse, and this time, when Jake passed behind the monster with a forward roll, the monster was unable to turn around in time. Sarah's sword was blocked again by sacrificing another dendrite, but her intervention provided the opportunity Jake needed to launch an unstoppable attack. An incandescent sword blow, even more powerful than the previous one, sliced through the alien's knee tendons and the dendrites that tried to stop it. Clang! Ouch! Jake quickly muffled a cry of pain as he felt the thumb holding the handle of his machete dislocate on impact. The Nosk's bones had held firm. If even after hitting with all his might with a great ether-reinforced machete, the alien was still standing, he had to face the facts. This opponent was just impossible to kill by decapitation or dismemberment. At the very moment of this realization, the Nosk's aura, which had been passive throughout the battle, intensified drastically, and for the first time the humanoid creature uttered a crazed battle cry. The pain and the fact of having been beaten up by miserable humans had finally angered him. The dendrites, which had only had a defensive role from the start, merged together to form thick strings, and a radiant white light began to shine from the appendages. 2 lashes of whips sounded, and soon after Jake and Sarah had joined Kevin into the stone wall. Chapter 273: Bitter Victory. Like Kevin earlier, Jake and Sarah slipped off the cracked wall, leaving a trail of blood in their wake. As Jake collapsed to the ground, he was so dizzy he had to bite his tongue to maintain consciousness. Sarah by his side had not yet come to her senses. Standing up with difficulty, he ran his hand behind his head and felt a warm, sticky liquid soak through his hair. This alien really got him good this time. But luckily, his bones were not to be taken lightly either. Back then, during his first ordeal, he had already broken through stone walls quite a few times, and with his new Murtharian body, it wasn't enough to put him in danger. Nevertheless, it was still extremely painful. Jake could not help but congratulate himself on the good work he had done in erecting these walls. Although the wall behind him was cracked and split as if it had just been hit by a catapult shot, the structure had held up well. Just for that alone, he did not regret wasting all that time stacking stones. More than 1.5 meters thick, they had built them in anticipation of such a situation. Of course, this was no time to indulge in self-gratification. The Nosk in front of them had had the decency not to exploit their vulnerable moment, but that did not mean that they were out of the woods yet. On the contrary, Jake could read a certain elation in the monster's gestures, a clear sign that it felt great joy to observe their discomfiture. But all of a sudden, the alien did something that shocked him deeply. The humanoid monster slowly lifted its steel helmet with the effigy of a creature from another world, revealing a hideous face with withered and blackened skin. Only its eyes were electric blue, but they were devoid of white, which paradoxically made it even more frightening. Its shapeless maw filled with sharp teeth stretched painfully several times without making the slightest sound, as if the alien was practicing its articulation before declaring with a rasp that would have given nightmares to the children. "You are weak. Cheap tricks." The muscles in Jake's face twitched as he listened to these words, which were as unnerving to hear as a car at -30°C failing to start, but he felt a different emotion as well. Seconds earlier, he thought the alien was taunting them, but that tired, old voice wasn't as dashing as he imagined. Far from mocking, what Jake felt in the tone of the Nosk was a sense of frustration and some kind of resentment. Despite this, the creature's fighting spirit had not diminished, and it was clear that the alien had no intention of retreating or negotiating. The spirit body of this enemy was very stable, and with his current expertise, Jake could read the unwavering resolution in the ether ripples of this opponent. More importantly, this Nosk had spoken in English. It had been a laborious attempt, but it just goes to show how smart this alien was. It was not a ferocious beast that was all brawn but no brains. It was possible that the alien was smarter than he was, but fortunately it did not seem capable of using its prodigious mental abilities offensively. During the brief moment when Jake and the alien were staring at each other like mad dogs, Sarah finally managed to recover. Her expression was haggard and she was staggering slightly, but her Myrmidian trance skill was keeping her in an alert state. As for Kevin, he had been the first one knocked out and was much stronger than the young woman. He was already awake when Jake and Sarah had crashed into the wall, but he hadn't found the courage to carry on fighting. The brief exchange with the Nosk had shaken him deeply. Regardless, Jake had not said his last word. As soon as he had slammed into the wall, Jake had known that a frontal confrontation against this alien would be a lost cause. Once serious, the Nosk could deploy colossal power through its dendrites, and each of them could act independently. It was like facing thousands of arms at once, each of them capable of spitting out blasts of energy that the enemy had not yet used. Even though Jake and Sarah came out of that first round on the losing side, the humanoid monster was still badly wounded, and it had allowed them to confirm that their weapons were working. It was the opposite for Kevin, whose keratin claws had broken cleanly after a few blows. As stingy as Jake might normally be about his money or ether, it was nothing compared to his own life. That was why he had directly sacrificed 50,000 ether points to pump gray ether into all the nearby needles under his control. Most of them had broken off or their tips had blunted on impact against the alien's armor and body, but once reinforced with that much sharpening ether, it no longer mattered. In just a few seconds, Jake had transformed 100 useless needles into a piercing ammunition capable of penetrating the skin and armor of a Nosk effortlessly. Although the alien in front had not moved, he had not missed anything of the sneaky tactics of this human. That was the reason why he had accused him of using cheap tricks. "Any last words?" Jake asked indifferently, calmly picking up his machete without taking his eyes off the enemy. Sarah had also rearmed. "I should be the one asking this question," Nosk answered coldly. At that very moment, the alien's resolute aura changed again, and a fanatical killing intent exploded from the monster's body. A psychic wave enveloped the entire stone house and beyond, and an intense headache clouded the vision of all of them. Tim, Lily, and the bear cub who had been left out of the scene lost consciousness on the spot. Kevin and Sarah held on, but blood was spurting from the 7 orifices in their faces. Only Jake was able to resist the mental attack, at the cost of a nosebleed. Horrified, he realized that it was very similar to the psychic attack of the brain eater that was devouring the brain of the hero mermaid back then. Much less devastating, of course. At least he wasn't completely helpless in the face of it. To his utter helplessness, he may have inherited a soul and a spirit body superior to others thanks to his Myrtharian bloodline, but he was a perfect neophyte in this field. Even with his present intelligence, there was a limit to what he could improvise. As he inspected the condition of his comrades at a glance, he felt his chest tightening. Tim and Lily's unconscious face was starting to turn dangerously cyanotic, and their rolling eyes suggested that they were already oscillating between life and death. The condition of the little koala bear and Lu Yin was unknown, but he didn't care. Mercifully, this mental blast did not last. As soon as the alien's aura had changed, Jake had counterattacked with all his might by throwing all his needles at the Nosk. The alien warrior had persisted for a mere second, only to be forced to focus his full attention on these projectiles if he wished to survive. The killing intent vanished as if it had never existed, but instead something much worse replaced it. As sharp as these needles were, they were too thin to slice through these thick, intertwined dendrites, but piercing them through and through was wonderfully simple. Soon, as a result of being pierced repeatedly, electric arcs began to flash out of these holes, and the energy usually contained in these miraculous dendrites began to leak out. Jake watched the scene in horror, and the Nosk seemed to know how it would end. Instead of retreating and fleeing, he ran towards the culprit with the momentum of a rhino. The stone wall that had been holding up shattered, and Jake was thrown from the hillside with the Nosk bumping into him. Both man and alien fell more than 20 meters and rolled another 50 meters or so before coming to rest against the enormous trunk of an extraterrestrial sequoia. While trying to get up, Jake gasped in agony when a sharp pain twisted his senses. He almost fainted on the spot. Every bone in his chest had been reduced to mush, and the condition of his organs underneath looked like red meat after being put in a blender. A mouthful of blood rose to his mouth, and for the second time in his life, he vomited something other than food. But when Jake saw the alien struggling nearby, he knew he couldn't complain yet. Clenching his blood-red fangs, he threw himself on the Nosk on the ground and began to ravage it with his fists in the same fashion as his cousin before him. His shining fists and claws smashed and sliced through every dendrite and part of the creature's body unharmed, and for a brief reprieve, he almost forgot his pain. But instead of dying neatly and silently, the dying Nosk cast a sad gaze on him. If only there was not this cold. The alien grunted, breathing in with difficulty. Jake halted his raised fist, which stirred up all his pain. Scanning the Nosk's body with his spirit body, Jake understood the words of this formidable enemy with dread. From the beginning, the alien was in no condition to fight. It was unable to resist the lure of a good battle and had appeared invincible earlier, but all of its joints were hampered and frozen as if its body was incapable of producing its own heat. The warrior's body was icy to the touch, and its nerves only partially responded. Before Jake could dwell on this truth, the alien breathed its last. The energy leaking from its dendrites lost the semblance of cohesion that kept them under control, and the alien's body began to glow like a sun during a supernova. Knowing what was about to happen, Jake crawled away to the verge of unconsciousness, and then levitated up with his last ounce of strength to the clearing where the stone house was hidden. Seconds later, when he peeked behind him, a blinding flash impressed his retinas, followed by a thunderous boom. The Nosk was truly dead now. Chapter 274: Loot and New Ranking. Suffocating on all fours on the frozen lawn in the clearing, the world around Jake was spinning dangerously, and he could no longer align coherent thinking. Yet, seeing the tremendous magnitude of the explosion, which had nearly leveled the equivalent of a soccer stadium, he couldn't help but be both bewildered and in awe. The Nosk could have self-detonated as soon as it had realized that it would not make it out alive, but it had chosen to control the energy leakage instead, leaving it unable to perform adequately, thereby sealing its fate once and for all. If only the alien had tried to talk from the beginning by explaining that it was seeking shelter during the storm, none of this would have happened. Nevertheless, Jake knew that this was impossible. This opponent had shown its hostility from the start by attacking them. Lu Yifeng, Lu Yan's brother, had undoubtedly been beheaded without warning by this bloody alien. Jake had a lot of questions about this Nosk at that very moment, but they would have to wait. Similar to the time he had been seriously injured in the water a week earlier, all his attention was dedicated to repositioning his bones and organs to ensure that the healing process would go smoothly. If a bone healed in the wrong position, he was at risk of being crippled for good, and he had no desire to break his bones again to correct a failed healing. But this time there was a catch. The storm was in full swing, and it was almost dark. Not that the sun would have made any difference. The clouds were so thick that the sun's ultraviolet radiation would never have reached the ground. Without heat and radiation, burying himself underground to heal faster was useless. At that very moment, he could only rely on his vitality and the diligent control of his ether. As painful as it was, Jake was already familiar with the process, and within minutes he was able to overcome the critical stage of the initial healing. His bones were in place, but his organs would still require special attention to avoid after effects. The entire procedure had been performed lying on the ground in the clearing, and the hailstones had never stopped falling. During the few minutes that Jake had dealt with his most serious injuries, his body had been battered by dozens of projectiles, each one harder and heavier than the next, leaving the surface of his body covered with bruises and bumps. His appearance was not too good at the moment. Despite this, he did not immediately rush to the stone house, which needed immediate repairs. Lily, Tim, and Daniel were in a worrisome state after the Nosk mental blast, but they had simply passed out. With their vitality and constitution, this level of injury was not as worrisome as it seemed. It was the same reason why Jake had kept fighting relentlessly when a normal human would have died of his injuries long ago. With one leap, he scaled down the hill to return to the site of the explosion and searched the devastated area with anxiety and expectation. As soon as he recognized the filaments of white light typical of the ether left at the death of an individual, he breathed a sigh of relief. It was the first time that one of his enemies had died in such an explosion, and to tell the truth, he had never before known whether pure ether could survive such a discharge of heat and energy. It was an unnecessary worry, though. The ether mass had not moved from the place where the Nosk had self-detonated, and the storm hailstones were passing through it without affecting it. Then, checking his ether status, he almost let out a joyful roar, which he instantly regretted when a stabbing pain pressed down on his chest. It took him almost a minute to recover, but the smile on his lips spoke for itself. All of his ether stats had gained almost 10 more points, elevating his abilities to the next level. With last week's hunt and the nights spent training to study the Green Soul Stone and forge his ether core, his status was nothing like it was at the beginning of the ordeal. Oracle Rank 5, Sergeant, 15.43M/100M, Ether Storage, 1,957,386 points. Body Status: Physics, Mertherian Body, LVL1. Height, 2.03 meters. Weight, 116 kilograms. Strength, 48.3 points. Agility, 40.5 points. Constitution, 64.2 points. Vitality, 59.6 points. Intelligence, 32.4 points. Perception, 29.6 points. NB, Average Human Stats, 5 points. Ether Status: Strength, S 125.6 points. Agility, A 124.6 points. Constitution, C 135 points. Vitality, V 135 points. Intelligence, I 198.3 points. Perception, P 195.2 points. Extrasensory Perception, EP 202.4 points. Soul Status: Mertherian Soul and Spirit Body, LVL1, 2 gold soul glyphs, a fish in water, apex ocean predator. Spirit Body, LVL5, stable, immaterial purpose. Cannot affect the physical world, but the psychic and etheric abilities are slightly amplified. The spirit is also more resilient and attracts more ether to sustain it. His ether status was quite abnormal compared to most participants. His mental and sensory stats were overdeveloped when they were supposed to be the most difficult to improve. His spirit body had also broken through level 5, and although the difference was not immediately noticeable, the effects were clear enough to see during that battle. He was the only one who had been able to remain on his feet in the face of the mental attack of the Nosk, and despite the severity of his injuries, he had not lost consciousness. Willpower alone was not enough without a strong spirit body to support it all. If he reached his physical and mental limits, no matter how determined he would simply die. As for his body status, it was the one that progressed the slowest. The first test was useless, since it was only a simulation and his muscle mass and physical condition were already close to their optimal shape and volume. Physical exertion had little effect on his body, and he fully depended on his Cantharian genetics to evolve further. For this, he needed to bury himself regularly in hot volcanic soil, mercilessly irradiated by a blazing sun. The environment of the native Cantharian planet was not so easy to reproduce, and he had not directed his efforts towards this aspect. Nevertheless, Jake had gained another 2 centimeters and put on another 2 kilos. He was beginning to seriously consider whether there was a limit to his growth spurt. If it continued like this, he might soon be unable to enter the human-only Oracle Playground cities. However, his body stats had risen by 1-2 points, and this could be considered decent considering he had made no special effort to improve them. Becoming taller and heavier provided him with an advantage most of the time as well, since his optimal power-to-weight ratio had not yet been achieved. The higher his ether stats, the more his body would seek to grow. This was the sad reality to accept. Still, the most shocking part of his new status was the amount of ether contained in his ether storage. More than 1,950,000 points. This was almost double the previous amount, and it meant that the sanctuary bubble had granted him the kill. The death of the Nosk alone had earned him almost 800,000 points, which was actually not that much. The rest came from the feats he had completed with Sarah and Tim, as well as the results of last week's hunt. Out of legitimate curiosity, Jake opened the player rankings information page, and he felt both proud and dismayed when he discovered his new ranking. 54th place, Jake, species, Mertharian 1,565,396 points, 1 kill. He had moved up several dozen places in a single fight, and for that he could be justifiably pleased with his performance. After all, he had just risked his life. The reason why he was depressed and pessimistic for the future was that the Nosk having disappeared from the player ranking was not Bawopi, the Nosk occupying the current 3rd place in the ranking, but a nobody. To be honest, until now Jake didn't know what a Nosk was, and apart from memorizing the names of the top 50 candidates, he hadn't really been interested in anybody. In other words, all he could deduce from his new ranking was that before this fight, Nosk had a comparable rank to his own. As aggressive as this alien may have been, it had apparently been quite low profile compared to the other members of its species. Because by checking the present ranking, he realized that 7 Nosks were actually occupying the top 50, including 3 in the top 20. This was a ridiculously high number compared to the hundreds of species participating in this second ordeal, which was equaled only by the Krishas and paradoxically humans. Jake found it hard to believe that so many humans had managed to survive so far, but he was not fooled either. The 3rd trial had just begun. As time passed, the situation would eventually be reversed. With the exception of Ruby, very few humans had accumulated kills, and this reflected a sad reality. Humans were more hunted than hunter on this island. Chapter 275 Post-Battle. Before returning to the base, Jake checked the disaster area one last time for any useful scraps, but unfortunately to no avail. When exploding, the Nosk's body had been thoroughly vaporized, and its bracelet had disappeared with it. Cutting off a participant's arm and leaving him alive to absorb his oracle device was not so easy to accomplish, and it was likely that many participants would prefer suicide to the idea of getting their bracelet demoted. Jake didn't know what the exact consequences of absorbing the bracelet would be, but he imagined at the very least a significant reduction in the efficiency of the available functions, a loss of ether proportional to the amount of ether contained in the ether storage, and potentially a temporary reduction in oracle rank. Naturally, this was all just his personal assumptions. He had never experienced this tragedy personally and did not know anyone who had directly experienced this situation. On the other side, he knew the benefits of assimilating another bracelet, and he could not help but long for the prospect of reliving such an event. With a last sigh of bitterness and regret, he dodged a huge hailstone by casually tilting his upper torso sideways before climbing back up the hill to his camp. He really should have tried to cut off this alien's arm while it was still alive. As injured as he was, Jake managed to hide his apparent signs of weakness. He was still wearing his leather armor, and except for his swollen face and arms, the internal damage he had sustained was impossible to guess without scanning him with an oracle device or a spirit body. The door had been ripped off its hinges as well as an entire wall panel, and the fire in the chimney had long since been extinguished by the freezing wind blowing in from outside. Kevin and Sarah were struggling to put the door back in place to block some of the wind, but it was a lost cause. When he returned to the clearing safe and sound, Sarah almost cheered with joy, but in the end, she just groaned and started to tend to her wounds. The deadly Nosk's mental wave had shaken her brain, and many small blood vessels had ruptured from the trauma. Aware that Tim, Lily, and Daniel's lives depended on her behavior, she had first checked their condition and then wrapped them in the island animal furs they had accumulated over the week. Only after that had she started to worry about the door being ripped off. Kevin was in a similar situation, but his bestial form was worthy of the threatening appearance it gave him. Although he had lost as much blood as Sarah, he had recovered much more quickly from the mental assault and immediately assisted her by listening to her instructions. If Jake had seen him sagely obeying Sarah's orders, he certainly would have taunted him non-stop on the subject for the next few days. But sadly, he had missed that great opportunity. Upon discovering that his cousin was seriously trying to fix the door, he decided to tolerate his existence for the time being. No matter how much he disliked him, he was a member of his family, and as such, it was 10 times safer to cooperate with him than with any other candidate. Because their grandfather had insisted that they help each other and collaborate as much as possible, those who decided to betray their own family during the ordeal were sure to regret their actions at a heavy price. Their grandfather's disapproval was not a tough trouble to deal with, but to be disinherited and rejected completely was definitely possible. If Jake was expelled from the family, it would have left him totally unmoved, but he didn't want to inflict this on his uncle and cousin Anya. "How are they doing?" Jake asked in the most normal tone possible to cover up his injuries. His face was smiling and relaxed, and he could not help but be proud of how far he had come in his acting. Sarah neglected her wounds for a few seconds and shook her head with sorrow. Their brains were badly damaged. "I don't know if they can heal from such a brain injury without suffering any after effects. I'm afraid the ordeal is over for them." As for Daniel, he was already seriously injured and in a coma even before this psychic attack took place. His cerebral arteries had ruptured, and he died instantly. Jake listened calmly to the young woman's report with an increasingly sullen expression. If the Nosk was chasing Lu Yin, this bitch truly had screwed them up good by running all the way back here. He hadn't forgotten her last words before she was knocked out by the alien. She was clearly hostile and full of bad intentions. The only reason she was still alive was that Lu Yifeng had sacrificed himself to save her, and that the Nosk was really looking for a shelter to weather the storm. It would have knocked on their door sooner or later. Ignoring the door and the destroyed wall for the moment, he in turn examined Tim, Lily, and the koala bear with his senses, but he came to the same conclusion as Sarah. They would probably survive because of their high constitution and vitality, but he did not know if human genetics could heal such wounds perfectly. The brain had always been an extremely complex and mysterious field. To avoid unpleasant surprises, he stuck his bracelet to theirs to access their status directly. His oracle rank being superior and the latter being unconscious, he faced no particular resistance, and detailed reports popped up in his mind. Lily was indeed human, but he was unsettled to learn that Tim was no longer human either. He had assimilated a Beskirian bloodline, and his anatomy was blessed with supernatural luck. Upon discovering the characteristics and perks brought by this bloodline, he couldn't help but feel a little jealous as well as slightly angry for hiding this ability behind them. No wonder they had found this clearing so easily. Even the Oracle had been unable to designate a safe place, and Tim was able to do so in less than 2 hours. As he remembered, it was indeed the boy who was leading the way back then. As for the koala bear, he was a Zwid literally called simpleton in his native gibberish. The alien had no vocal cords, but Kevin claimed that communicating with canids and Ursity was no problem for him. Jake could simply use telepathy, but he refrained from dampening his enthusiasm. Daniel was as dead as a doornail, and after assessing the extent of the damage, he did what he could to optimize their recovery. With his telekinesis, he meticulously drained all the bloated blood that had accumulated inside their skull and was exerting pressure on their damaged brains. Once this stage was completed, the 2 children and the bear could be considered to be out of the woods, but the rest was up to them. Only Lu Yin was left, and he felt no remorse when he pressed his bracelet against hers to retrieve all the data concerning her. They had the same oracle rank, so it was still possible. Jake was seriously tempted to cut off her arm to absorb her bracelet, but in the end he eventually abstained. After dissecting the report about the young woman, she no longer held any secrets from him, and he knew that she posed no immediate threat. In memory of Louis Feng, I'm going to give you a chance. You better not waste it. He grumbled as he got up. He had no intention of attending to her injuries. He then took over from Kevin and Sarah to repair the collapsed wall and door, and with his telekinesis and earth manipulation, it only took him a few seconds to put the door back in place and plug the wall. Of course, the plugged wall had been clumsily sealed, but it was enough to prevent the freezing air from creeping into the building. Sarah then proceeded to rekindle the fire, and soon a pleasant warmth filled the room again. For the rest of the day, everyone dressed their wounds in their own corners, and night finally fell. The familiar green light soon began to radiate from the clearing, and an invigorating energy soothed their exhausted minds. This was what Jake had been waiting for, and he used the mental clarity it brought to cleanly repair the wall and door as Kevin looked on in awe. Never in his wildest delusions could he have imagined that one day he would have to depend on his cousin to survive a mere thunderstorm. He was feeling like a child again. The stone house being as good as new, the still-awake trio feasted afterwards without saying a word, and soon after Jake bid them farewell before disappearing underground without offering any explanation. He still telepathically warned Sarah that he would be nearby. In fact, as soon as he disappeared, he had buried himself under the chimney fire as close as possible to the Naquat deposit below the clearing. Combined with the nutrients provided by the soil, the warmth of the fire and the soul energy of the green soul stone, Jake was finally able to dedicate himself fully to his recovery without any worries.